just we'll see now. Evening.
Oh, heck. Oh, crikey.
Now, Alexi, don't be ashamed. Curing problems like yours is my game. I'll just say some words one at a time, and you say the first word that comes into your mind. Ready?
Teddy?
Bad.
Man.
Sun.
Tan.
Bacon.
Flan.
Prince of Wales.
Checks.
Brussels sprouts.
Sex!
Word association is giving me away. Word association says the words I don't want to say. Word association lets you inside my brain. Join the word association, it will drive you insane.
Okay. Worrying.
Sheep.
Little bow.
Peep.
Trouser.
Press.
Lock.
Net.
Tortoise.
Sex.
Word association is giving me away. Word association says the words I don't want to say. Word association lets you inside my brain. Join the word association, it will drive you insane.
Throw.
Up.
Coffee.
Cop.
Panties.
Saxophone.
Rudolph.
Hess.
Duffel coat.
Sex.
Word association is giving me away. Word association says the words I don't want to say. Word association lets you inside my brain. Join the word association, it will drive you insane.
Mr. Seal, you've got the filthiest mind. I'm really terrified of what I might find. But as a doctor, it's my duty to pursue your case. We'll do further research back at my place. Taxi!
Cab. Scab.
What?
Saxophone.
That's Alexi Sales Word Association. You can find that on the album Meanwhile. That was actually featured in a sketch on one of his comedy programs at the time. They had a video of it. It's very entertaining. You can go see out that on YouTube if you're so inclined. Today we're going to be talking about several different releases. My little theme for today, actually, my little trivial theme, the last couple of shows I decided to talk about releases from specific decades. You know, I did the 20s, 10s, 2000s, 90s. Here we are as Alexi Sales indicating there the 1980s. You've accommodated us actually for the most part. I believe 3 of your picks of the 5 were from the 1980s, which is
Oh, nice. I
cool for the
didn't
theme.
think about it at all.
It's
I didn't even
about-
realize you did an 80s show, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about 80s albums on Mandala, partly because you know how like a lot of those YouTube.
Well, I thought the Rodalius album was from 2011, because that's what YouTube credited it as.
Oh no,
Yeah,
that must be a
okay.
remaster of some sort.
Yeah, it must have just been the re-release, because they do that sometimes. So I just assumed it was like a 2011 album.
No.
But okay.
Like, he has albums up to fairly recently, to be fair.
Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, you know, a lot of those big YouTube music channels, they tend to discuss, kind of boom oriented, they tend to discuss the 70s predominantly, you know, all these great
Yeah,
LPs from
and
the
maybe the
70s.
80s.
A little bit.
And
but-
touches of the 90s.
but- and albums we've all know and talk about.
Yeah, Guns N' Roses maybe, or
Well,
what have you.
Yeah, we certainly wouldn't talk about, well, at least, I know you wouldn't talk about GNR either, I know that.
Oh, but you're referencing the Porcupine Tree guy or whatever.
Well, not him, I mean, we'll see Tranquility and all those other
Yeah.
contrarians to some extent.
Yeah, like the popular underground albums, or like popular like record nerd albums, sure.
But even like when they discuss the 70s, it tends to be like now it's sort of passe to discuss all the big prog albums of the 70s because it's got its little revival now. Younger music fans seem to enjoy the old prog stuff.
Yeah.
They're very well rated on RYM. So as a
they have
result,
their fan bases.
there's no point really discussing all these now really canonized 70s releases. And so as a
Sure.
result, I feel like the 80s is sort of underappreciated. It's seen as a decade full of like, you know, a single-centric, you know, pop hits rather than, you know, album-oriented listenings. But right from the first Mandala, I was trying to insist, no, these albums by artists like Associates, OMD, Wire,
Well,
they're as serious. You brought up China Crisis on that show.
There is a heavy, like rockers, the sort of people you're talking about, even at the time seemingly, backlash to 80s music tropes in the way that like your first album indicates quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's seemingly from the fans of the band.
Right.
Yeah. Which is, sort of true. There was like rocker subtypes, the things they despise the most are where music was going and did end up going, which is drum machines and synthesizers, right?
Yeah, they wanted a sense of like authenticity, which is interesting because you can trace that to a sort of a strain of the hippie era, like that sort of, you know, folk sort of, you know, pantheistic. But there was also an element of high production values and sort of experimentation associated with the counterculture as well. You think about Pink Floyd, obviously, and the Beatles, more importantly, even.
Sure.
And then North Krautrock.
Am I the one? Are we doing my album first?
Yes, we are.
Okay, well in that case we'll get to yours very soon. But in this case, I guess, this is like where the post-punk sort of cafe thing turns into like experimental pop music. Mm-hmm. I went with the Front Lawns, songs by the Front Lawns. A little like duo of like Kiwi musicians who I think were like sort of scene veterans and a bit like theatre school sort of thing. Because initially I just thought of this as like a pop album, but then I later learned a few days later that they're actually like initially like a sort of stage comedy duo.
Right,
And in a way they're actually kind of like the original like Flight of the Conchords.
Yeah, interesting that.
I didn't even realize that till after listening to this album like 3 times even. Because like even though there is a sort of comedic element to a lot of the songs on this album, it also does take itself fairly seriously as pop music as well, but then still has like a sort of garage modesty about it as well, you know, obviously coming from that sort of post-punk thing. But I guess I just found this because I was compiling a list of New Zealand albums in case of the apocalypse, and I was, I guess, just initially like fascinated by the cover of the album, right?
Oh, I know.
And I saw like a black and white photo, and it kind of looks more like Slint, you know, that thing where it's floating in the water.
Everyone knows that, yeah.
So it's sort of similar in that sense for people who don't know what it is. And initially I was like, I'm not quite sure about this until like at the first song, there's just this like change in melody and key, and there's a lyric where they're like, and they all want to turn you down like the sound on your TV, and I'm like, wow, that's a lovely little like pop moment there. And then so I kept listening to the album and then was definitely sold when there was a song where it's just like, oh hey mate, how are you? How you going?
That's
and
classic.
these people talking.
That was
like,
genius.
I was like, oh, all right, I'm definitely sold on this now. And then all the other songs once again had all these like very like enjoyable like melody shifts and like just sort of very populist but very classy pop music sort of stylings, you know, like just little variations on songwriting tropes and stuff like that. And then it was like also quite funny, and I do feel the second half of the album loses a bit of that sort of steam. The first half was definitely like I felt every song is just killer. And it sort of plays out a bit more, though it gets a bit more instrumental and even a bit jazzier later on, so it becomes less poppy and a bit more in that like 80s lounge sort of vein, you know. But as an overall sort of thing, I was just kind of captivated by it straight away, and sort of I found it like in a very short term it having a lot of listening value, you know. Sorry, that was my dad calling me. And and even like the ballad song on the first side I thought was really compelling, even before I realized what it was about. Just like a deceased brother or something.
Okay, wow.
But it had like this very, for a ballad, right, this very picturesque like instrumental and like lyrical accompaniment to it, you know. And just like lamenting like sort of separations of relationships. Yeah. And it like even mirrored the age that I'm at to like what his brother was, like to my own like interpersonal relationships. And I love when like lyrical things do that, you know. It really draws you in at least me in a subjective sense. but also like has a sort of more wider like ethereal quality to it. I feel. I don't know, this album sort of, what it reminds me of was coming back home on the bus today. I just saw this like mother and son, and the mother just bought him this like Ninja Go or whatever, you know, that Lego set.
I think so.
And he's just like holding it up, and it's like this big dragon thing. And to him, it's like the coolest thing in the world.
Sure.
It's like a full-on moment for them. And I was just like happy to watch it happen. That's sort of what it was. I was just like that little kid with this album, you know. I was like, oh, this is kind of, you know that feeling when you get like a gift from like your parents at that age, you know. And it's
Sure,
just,
yeah.
It's the whole world to you in that moment, you
Yeah,
know.
holy God, yeah.
So I thought that was really neat. It's kind of like like what I always wished something like Crowded House were like, you know?
Yeah.
Because like they do have little moments of like little pop purity bliss like choruses, but their overall songs are just a bit, I don't know, just a bit sort of, I guess what like my brother would say, are done to impress like music teachers. They have all those little moments in there.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, that music sort of that sort of music annoys the hell out of me, especially when it's all very generic at the end of there, and then there's these like musos insisting, oh no, there's this, and it's like, I don't want music to be made for annoying cunts like you.
Yeah, that sort of sentiment is sort of where something like Crowded House is always, it was similar sort
That's
of
why the
stuff.
Police used to annoy me, to be honest.
Similar
Because there'd be these
sort of
annoying little
groups,
pop
yeah.
ditties, and then people would go, oh no, but I insist, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't need to know music theory to be impressed with jazz, so this music can fuck off, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well that's true, yeah. Jazz can be appreciated without any knowledge of theory.
Exactly, you're just like, holy moly, look at all this creativity and unpredictability
Yeah,
and
for sure.
spontaneity on display.
I'll get on that topic later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just sort of was very captivated by like sort of the modest pomposity of this album, if that makes any sense.
I guess so. I guess I might go into my thoughts
Yeah,
now.
far away.
So, yeah, this little thing is here. God, it's impossible not to think of it as a New Zealand album, and not. I mean, because obviously it's so imbued with the culture, but also like sonically, I think of this as in the context of could this have been like a UK or an Australian album? It is something sonically reminiscent of this could have been made in Australia at that time, and I know like technologically, there's no reason it could have been something like this could have existed in the UK, but the UK's music scene's a little bit different at time. It's colder, it's a bit more cynical, it's a bit more very conscious of social acceptability and or commercial success, even in like sort of a punk cred sense. Whereas like, I mean you do get stuff like the Grebo a little bit later, to be fair. I remember you've Pop Elite itself.
Yeah.
But even then, that's a little bit art school.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
and this is a bit-
even
and
New
you
Zealand
bring
did
out-
some Grebo too.
Oh, fair. And this can be considered a little bit more of a, you said theatre school, which is, yeah, but it's sort of like, they're a bit more, you know, they're very secure in their sort of wants and enthusiasm. And I find it, it's sort of more sunny and bright and sort of whimsical sonic priorities are very, not in a romantic way, and in a very sort of childlike way.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's quite brilliant. I was very, very enamored with it. And I think I want to bring up the song that was most memorable to me on the album. It's actually on the second half. It's a
Yeah.
song called Claude Rains.
Oh,
which
that's
is
great
about,
with the Ingrid Bergman.
About Claude Rains' character in Casablanca.
Yeah.
It's just such an interesting little idea that these Kiwi guys were really enamored with the film from the early 1940s, Casablanca. And I have to wonder, like, to what extent are they sort of really wanting to be in on this sort of big cultural moment, which is, generations appreciating Casablanca as this timeless classic, or are they genuinely like taken by it? Like, to what degree is it a sort of a them trying to be
I felt it was
more
a
romantic
bit
than-
of both.
Yeah, because it does feel real. I mean, I was really taken by Casablanca as a 12-year-old, so it's not impossible for people removed from it to be really, really into it.
Yeah.
But no, it's just such a magical idea to take a song about the Claude Rains figure in Casablanca and go Reynold and sort of I mean, Rains is a really interesting actor in general. Like he features, of course, in discussed recently on this channel, Hitchcock's Notorious, along with, of course, Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant, three very tremendous, highly skilled actors, and possibly all three of them at their best, possibly in Notorious, which is really remarkable. Some of the best acting in a Hitchcock film, and there's a number of films to choose from with really sort of spellbinding acting performances. Though, speaking of that, Cary Grant in Suspicion is close to the top of his list, to be fair. But anyway, but no, I just want, and also Rain's in as Dryden in Lawrence of Arabia. We can't forget that as a smallish part but memorable. Also playing a Frenchman, like in Casablanca, but it's such a beautiful, shameless little thing, and I just the production's great. It's amazing how and it'll be evidenced by definitely one of the other two of the other New Zealand albums you pick. Spoilers. But
Spoiler.
they're very slickly and well produced, and I've heard other examples of New Zealand albums from around this time that are extremely well produced. Though some of them may have been recorded in Australia, like the Headless Chickens you picked a while ago sounds great.
Oh yeah, that was made with the government grant. Yeah.
And was the Chills Submarine Bells recorded in Australia?
Oh, I think that
sounds beautiful.
I think that might have been even recorded in like LA.
Okay, true.
If not, the Soft Bomb was recorded in LA. I'd have to look up where Submarine Bells was recorded. It might have been in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Because they had great. They clearly had great recording studios, and they weren't trying too hard to make the music sound too expensive or cold or sterile. I mean, maybe that's not the intent of some of the high-end pop music of, say, the UK or America, but that's sometimes where it can get to. There's still a warmth to the sort of high-end pop music coming out in New Zealand at this time, seemingly.
Yeah.
And because even if high-end pop music in Australia, a lot of it also suffers from this sort of over-sterile quality. Maybe the songs just suck in general, but that's...
It's
put that on In Excess. So In Excess probably were recording in Australia at that time.
Yeah, they made the move to LA as well.
LA, okay, yeah.
Yeah, or England.
Yeah.
Or England first, then LA.
Probably, yeah.
I think they did end up in LA. But yeah, it's funny you point out that like it is very Kiwi centric or about the culture itself. I even saw there was a write up of it on their like audio culture government cultural website. And the last like paragraph was sort of a very like eloquent way expressing how important that is. And I was like, yeah, that's a good read. I can't quite remember it, but it's out there. If people just look up the Front Lawns audio culture NZ, it'll come on. But so yeah, no, it is sort of, it's seemingly an important cultural piece, or at least I just having known a Kiwi person, sort of see the cross translate, or us also being close to New Zealand,
Yeah.
It's sort of Australia, like New Zealand little brother complex type thing, I suppose. But it's a cool little group. I happened to see they also made like a short film from the second song theme from the name of the short film, and it's this weird like 12-minute like time loop piece. I actually thought that was kind of funny and good as well. But because it's got that like, sort of Kiwi sense of humor that's very particular to there, which I think was a conscious part of the whole. It was like part of the concept of the whole group, especially of the initial theatre thing, because I saw a video of them just on like a Today Tonight in the 80s, and they got kind of famous over there for doing like a bit where they would do like percussion with just like kitchen, like breakfast table stuff, like teaspoons and stuff like that. And they also claimed that they were like the first people to do the like New Zealand colloquialisms in comedy or whatever. Like everyone, they were always just doing like British or American humour. And then I asked my Kiwi mate, and he said, "Nah, they're lying. There was this guy and this guy before." Like every Kiwi claims they're the first one to do something.
Of course.
I find it kind of fascinating.
That's interesting.
But yeah, cool little band, I suppose. And just I'm glad I looked through those Kiwi releases to sort of find some interesting little like just sort of lost artifacts, I suppose, because they seem to be a little bit lost in New Zealand as well. Like.
Yeah. Because,
maybe overshadowed by the Fly of the Conchords scenes, who are funny in the 2000s sense, right?
Yeah,
It's more like in your face.
Am I the one who instigated that, looking at that list? Like I
probably found them on like a chart list. Yeah.
I cast it, didn't I?
But I was putting together just like stuff my Kiwi mate was saying, so I'd remember like albums he'd tell me about. And then you're like, oh, you can just go to the chart edit.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, sick. Because I think you told me that before, but I just never really... I didn't think you could do it with countries, but you can. Yeah,
it's good like that. Yeah, I really love this album. I was very, very happy to encounter it here. I'll definitely listen to it again a few times in the future. They have a second album. Do you know much about that?
No, I haven't heard that. Oh, actually, yeah, funny that you bring it up. I saw a video that was from the second album, like a music video they did. And the song was hilarious. I guess it's more like abruptly funny. It was just called I'm Right. And I felt like it was even like calling me out because it's just them going like, hey, look at this. Oh, look at that in the paper. I'm right. And I always do that to my Kiwi mate. I'm like, oh, look at this in the paper.
Right.
I was just like, oh my god. I was like, the song's like personally calling me out. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It was pretty funny.
The album's from 1993. It's called More Songs from the Front Lawn. And I suppose if we're going to be leaving New Zealand for the time being, you know,
Scotland.
we'll say goodbye to John Dolan from the War Note. He resides in New Zealand a lot of the time, so we'll be.
See,
but
he
also
knows the bombs
travels-
are going to fly, that's why.
Oh no, he got a job there.
Oh, yeah.
University of Otago.
Oh, okay.
And
Nice.
since the 90s, I believe. And he still travels a lot now. Talks about it on their Radio War Node podcast. So, like Dolan, we're based in New Zealand, we're going to be travelling around. This time we're going to the UK, and this is a famous institution of that particular country's recorded music culture.
Yeah, even in Australia, they were big in the 70s.
Yeah, and it's funny how much American media from the 70s, or set in the 70s, references Jethro Tull.
Yeah?
Like, I remember there's an episode of Freaks and Geeks where the characters talk about, oh yeah, so-and-so, we saw them open for Tull.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, these guys went to see, like, Tull were considered like a cool band to go and see. Like, that seems surprising.
Oh, in like the
in
mid-70s,
hindsight.
sure, yeah.
You know, but, you know, it's just fascinating because well, one, because to the degree to which, I mean, I guess the prog bands in the UK did cross over in America fairly successfully. Like, you hear about
Yes, and ELP.
ELP having big tours over in America.
And then Genesis in the 80s.
Yeah, I don't think that Genesis didn't quite make it over there. I don't know if King Crimson did either, but they have the live album USA, so obviously they played shows over there.
Yeah, even like bands like Gentle Giant would have toured the US.
They opened for Sabbath in the US infamously, and then someone threw the
Yeah.
cherry bomb on stage, and Phil Schulman calls them a bunch of cunts.
Nice.
That audio's online, you can listen to that.
Yeah.
But anyway,
That actually sounds hectic.
we're not talking about 70s Jethro Tull today. Well, Jethro Tull are
Oh,
interesting.
It's right on the cusp.
Yeah, that's a good point. Tull are really, I think one of my favourite things about the 70s prog groups is not just that output they put out in the early part of that decade, but some of these groups managed to stick together or go on hiatus and get back together, and they put out interesting music throughout the decade, sometimes incorporating the trends and styles and sonic...
Put a disco beat here and there and shit like that. Yeah,
sort
for sure.
of, sort of sonic cultural requirements, if you will, of each subsequent decade. Tull were no exception. King Crimson did this to some degree. They were on hiatus in like the late 80s and early 90s, but obviously they got back together for Frack in 95, for example. Rush never really broke. Oh, there's that very brief hiatus in the late 90s, early 2000s, but obviously Rush were together for a very long time, and Genesis, to some extent, did something interesting with their sound in the 80s, but afterward is debatable. We don't like the 90s stuff. Even Camel, I've championed Camel's transforming into the 80s to some extent, and even in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think they put out relatively interesting sort of neo-prog. The point is, I've even somewhat soft on some of the stuff Yes put out in the 90s and 21st century, just sort of a bit pastiche, but I like... And some of it's kind of soft and acoustic based, and I think sometimes Yes, well, even though I used to say "And You and I" isn't as good as some Yes fans claim it is, I think Yes do have an interesting ear for that sort of composition, and it comes out in like
Steve
the early
Howard is a
2010s
very
albums.
good acoustic guitar
Exactly. So like this, like We Have Heaven is beautiful, for example. I've always adored that, and what's it? That little instrumental near the end of Fragile, Mood for a Day, I think it is.
Yeah, it's something like
That's a
that.
masterpiece.
Steve
So-
Howe song, actually.
Yeah, so like Fly From Here and Heaven and Earth, I would say I like, even though it's not indicative of music going on in the early 2010s, to be fair. Well, kind of, Indie Landfill maybe. No, seriously, but they're very pretty. The point is, as much as I adore like a lot of punk and post-punk bands, they're as interesting discographies as any, every album year 70s act, even if they're only together from 79 to 82. Just in 2 albums they can put out a body of work that rivals anyone's. But obviously they didn't make music beyond a certain point, or worse, they sold out afterward and just made crap for like the next few decades. So that's the interesting dichotomy between those two bands. But the Tull managed, I think, quite interestingly for a prog band going over the decades. And whilst I could champion some Tull from the 90s, I do plan to in future potentially. This is an 80s show, obviously, and we're championing A from 1980. The more infamous example of Tull in this decade, no, 2 more. Well, in terms of the Sonics, Under Wraps
I'm
from
surprised you didn't
1984.
bite the bullet and just go Under Wraps.
I feel like, well, let me say this. I think A is a more interesting album, And I also think Under
Okay.
Wraps would be a bit on the nose, like, hey guys, I'm
Yeah,
champion
yeah,
Under
no,
Wraps. It's just
yeah,
like,
no, that's true.
I'm going to be mentioning that I champion Under Wraps, talking about A anyway. I do really
Yeah,
like
no,
Under
that
Wraps.
makes a lot of sense actually.
But A, I think, was a more
Because
successful
Under Wraps is a bit of a
incorporation.
contrarian choice. Like, I guess if they invited you on that show, you'd pick that because it's the name of the show.
That's probably
Whereas
fair to say.
this it seems like a contrarian choice for Tull fans as well, though. From what I was reading of like Tull fan reviews.
Yeah.
But I'll get into that later.
But it is liked more than Under Wraps. By
Yeah,
fans.
that seems to
It's
be-
something else I seem to
that seems to
notice.
be just like pointed at and just being like, put it in the bin, rather
shame.
than even like give it at least one spin.
The other more controversial Tull album from the 80s in a way is Christopher Nave for the music, what was it, MTV controversy. But that's a whole different stupid thing.
Yeah, that is.
But anyway,
That's by like Metallica fans, not
Yeah.
Tull fans.
A from Jethro Tull. Wow, maybe one of the more interesting Jethro Tull albums. What a beautiful what an astonishing production they put together here. How layered, how intricate, and how batshit. Like it's just, audiophile friendly, but also kind of frenetic and crazy and sort of disorientating at the same time in a way that's really interesting and sort of makes you think of the first time you encountered certain prog bands like Gentle Giant even. And Tull's musicianship is often out of caliber of a Gentle Giant-esque group, but they made more conventional songs for the most part.
Yeah.
And Tull have a very interesting tendency / Ian Anderson to there's a lot of big sonic ideas, and Ian Anderson as a producer is a really important way of identifying why Tull are kind of doing what they're doing in the moment. Because I think Ian Anderson is as producer minded as he is like songwriting minded, and maybe even more so. And so as a result, I think you have someone who
I assume
is-
around this time he would have been.
I think for the remainder going forward.
Yeah, maybe not in the earlier days.
Oh no, I'm thinking more Songs from the Wood onward. Actually.
Yeah.
As songwriting oriented as Songs from the Wood is, like it's a very 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 specialized production where he's
Yeah.
decided to try and
In almost like a Brian Wilson sort of vein.
yeah, he's tried to incorporate all these very organic sounds in the artificially composed these little sounds from nature soundscape.
Yeah, like
and
loops
incorporate
of-
them as rhythms and as they were drum beats in a more otherwise commercial or soul disco R&B. Like it's weirdly adapting to the time sort of subtly to a degree that no one notices. But he's done something he's doing for himself and maybe a few other audiophiles. And that's what I feel about A, because it isn't Tull going commercial. This ain't a commercial album, really. This is an album for like. Ian thought that the prog fans were interested in experimentation and musical creativity, period. But he was incorrect. They were interested in sort of the symphonic prog sort of note density tropes. And this has a little bit of that. But it's imbued between these sort of new wave or synth pop-esque droney moments, these strange choruses and sometimes offbeat and sort of atonal verses, and then they lead into proggy though quite out there solo instrumental moments. It's an album that I feel
classic Tull flute solos.
exactly. Oh, I love how sometimes there'll be electronic stabs which make you think, is that the flute? But they're mimicking the fact that the flute's going to appear a little bit later.
They play off each other a bit as well. Yeah.
It's very compositionally sophisticated. I think it's one of the more impressive productions / projects in the Tull storyline. And I think it's a real shame that it seems to be a bit of a dark horse. Under Wraps, I understand. They went full on in that direction, and it can be alienating. And it's a lot less, I don't know, it has a lot less in common with their older progressive rock than I think A does. And so that's why I'm a little bit, I think it's a bit disappointing that I can understand to some extent why, like, there's some 70s prog people, they don't like any synth pop, and so if they don't like Under Wraps either, that's just going to be that.
Sure.
But A, it's such a
Well, it's got drum machines, which is also an unholy thing, apparently.
true.
Yeah.
But I would encourage people to think of the albums put out by people like Peter Gabriel / Robert Fripp / them collaborating, or Eno around this time. And if you're into those things, try to think of Ian Anderson along the lines of those guys, because I think he's more than just a sort of virtuoso sort of composer who wants to put these sort of symphonic prog suites together, because even the Tull do engage in that occasionally after this point, like in 95's Roots to Branches, which has sort of fusion and world music elements, and that's a really brilliant underrated album too.
Sure.
But the fans tend to like that one, so all well and good.
Yeah.
I would encourage certain maybe SOT types. But I think they do like this album, as far as I know. I could be wrong.
Okay.
I think Proxy talked about this once. I don't know.
Okay.
But I think it's an album that's well worth championing. I know there's a Stephen Wilson mix out there, so if that encourages you to go check it out again, go do so. I'm glad he's a fan.
Yeah.
Otherwise he probably wouldn't have mixed it. But it's also just an example of the group at some of their creative best, in my opinion. And important to think of Ian Anderson, I think, as if you want to really appreciate what they're trying to do here, because you might think these are clunky, sort of unfinished or sort of confused compositions. It's an experimental producer's what's going on here.
Yeah, the production's definitely its most like sort of eclectic quality,
and the
which is probably why it rubs these people the wrong way.
The one more thing I want to mention to people, just in case I happen to forget a bit later, if one is fond of or Under Wraps, check out Ian Anderson's solo album, his first solo album of I think 5 over the decades since it. It's called Walk Into Light, I believe, which I think is a really strong album. It's a bit more stream and smooth lined and less sort of instrumentally oriented. It's more maybe purely electronic in ways. It came out the year before Under Wraps, but I think it's a really strong piece of work. Very fascinating project. But anyway, I've been talking for a little bit now, so I guess I'll hand it over to you, the famous Tull fan.
Yeah, I'm the world's biggest Tull fan. I'm like I said to you the other day, I have like a love-hate relationship with Ian Anderson. Like there are certain elements of his personality and like sort of songwriting personality that sort of like that harkens back to even something like the name Jethro Tull. Of
course, the famous horticulturalist.
Yeah, exactly. There's that sort of like element of, for one, English whimsy, like sort of folk traditionalism, sort of in touch with one's own like sort of cultural heritage quality to it, but playful about it as well, which I do appreciate. But then at the same time, I don't know, there's just a sort of, there's something about his like style of like sort of I don't know what you call it, like just something about like his sort of like the way he, I don't know, he sort of like always does half measures, never goes full into one direction, and always sort of gets like a bit of everything, but doesn't quite balance it in a way that is, say, comparable to someone like Frank Zappa. But I feel Zappa does it with a bit more of an oomph and a personality that's sort of in your face and like and sort of like eccentric but comfortable in its own eccentricity. It's Frank Zappa feels comfortable in his skin.
Definitely.
But I've always felt through, I don't know much about Ian Anderson, I don't know the person obviously, but through his music I've always felt like there's just something like where he never, like, he has all these creative ideas and themes and like compositional aspects, but the songwriting capacity that comes from the soul within art and music. There's just something there that's like, it's not there, and in its place is a sort of artifice, I feel, which sometimes really works, but famously probably works the best when he's doing it about that. Isn't that what, Thick as a Brick is pretty much about?
Like about a subject.
Yeah, like this boy who's like similar. It feels like he's writing about himself.
Yeah, it could be.
And it's sort of in a very soulful way, Whereas, by the time Passion Play and Minstrel in the Galley and all these things are sort of like projected reality conception of his own like sort of internal prejudice on the world or something like that. He feels like the sort of like the opposite of a starving artist, like a sort of like middle class artist. I guess what people accuse Genesis of.
Yeah.
Whereas Peter Gabriel comes at it from the more like crazy performative sort of conceptual art level, right? Whereas like Ian Anderson's always one foot in both worlds,
Yeah.
Which I think like if this album was like completely, and I think the story goes right that it was going to be a solo.
Oh, you ought to have mentioned, yeah, it was going to be, that's why it's called A, it was going to be his debut solo album.
Yeah,
Walking to
and
Life a little bit later.
the label convinced him to make it a Tull album and put a few more like sort of familiar Tull elements into it.
Yeah, as far as I know, I think enough of the band were playing on, I know Martin Barr, I'm pretty sure he was playing on it anyway, whereas obviously they didn't have a drummer, and I think they maybe hired, well, maybe they just had a hired bassist anyway, but he eventually, I'm pretty sure, toured with it as Jeffrey Tull,
Yeah.
became a band member.
Yeah, and the band sort of stayed together because of that. Because I think he was going to break it up or something.
I believe so. I've read that. I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. So by bringing it back into those sort of like you know how people like say theoretically a prog person might sort of put their noses up to like AC/DC or that old
sure.
AC/DC gem of how they just write the same riff over and over again. But like sometimes when I listen to different Tull albums, I feel like the same permutations are just being used over. The like those things are he always like sort of recycles them in a way. Whereas if you like those Tullish elements, right, the symphonic prog elements. Whereas if you like went into the deep end of a sonic idea further, rather than having to sort of pull it back into those tropes, I feel it would have at least appeal more to me. But I could see which is ironic enough because it seems the Tull fans like hate this album because of those elements that say I would like, but sort of still like it a little bit because of a few songs keep those elements of it, And I kind of want the opposite to go on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But having said all that, I do respect Ian Anderson to a degree because it's kind of ironic. That might even be part of like him actually expressing his soul is in that weird way, and so it just comes at it from a more sort of I don't know, rehearsed quirky angle.
Yeah.
Is sort of how I feel about Ian Anderson. He almost feels like a rehearsed quirky, and that is some people's thing. Like, Zooey Deschanel movies were popular in the 2000s.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, That's sort of where I'm at with Ian Anderson. But yeah, it's strange. You can't like blame it for what it is though. That's the thing, and I do appreciate it for what it is. I'd love to have a conversation with Ian Anderson because of all those things. Like, I wouldn't be starstruck. I'd just be like talking to him about music and stuff. I feel,
Right. Yeah.
I did see an interview with him once, and he seems like a good interviewer. At least he has insights, but they're always very particular to him and very like seemingly like not too like conscious of others and stuff like that.
Okay.
Which might be an element of the music that does make it very like particular. Like even doing something like picking up the flute, and he's known as the guy with the flute, is very conducive of that, right? At least I feel.
So how does this compare in your mind with other Tull albums that you've heard?
I'm a bit of a sort of, I guess you'd just say like Tull pleb. Because my two favourites are probably like Aqualung and Thick as a Brick. Though I do like the first two a bit as well. They're kind of...
No, they're cool.
They're kind of cool, yeah. Especially there's like an instrumental that I think's on the second album, which is mostly him doing the flute. I forget what it's called, but that's a cool as fuck like late 60s song. And then the middle 70s stuff, it's alright. I'm not the biggest fan of though, but I kind of like Stormwatch as well.
I like Stormwatch,
yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's just because like my mum had that record as a kid, so I heard it a few times. But I feel that it's also got a sort of atmosphere about it that's, I don't know. It's a bit like Blue Oyster Cult, like playful gothic or something. As well as the folky thing, but yeah, that whole, like, the theme of that album really speaks to me, the whole Stormwatch thing and the cover and just it feels like you're a lighthouse keeper or something. I don't know. I dig that, I don't know, I just sort of dig that one.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and this one's the one after that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I guess I'd be a bigger Stormwatch fan, though this album is... I just wish it went further into those 80s sort of things. It's strange, though, because, like I was saying before, all the fans they use phrases like dated-sounding synthesizers, and it's just like a really lame criticism of something, I feel.
Those sort of synthesizer sounds sort of came back into popularity.
Exactly,
so, like,
yeah. Drum machines and those synthesizers are the current music. So
what's going on, guys?
That's why I said I do respect Ian Anderson, because there is something there, like at least musically and compositionally, where, he's right on the ball, right?
I was going to suggest him going all out is under wraps, though. right?
It's got a few too many like pop elements, which might even be why the fans hate it even more. 'Cause it ditches that bluesy songwriting sort of, and like, you know.
No, it
pop
does, yeah.
For the pop, just 80s pop.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Which is probably the part of it that actually I don't mind, you know.
Yeah.
And the instrumentals, they are a bit dated perhaps in the mid 80s sense, but in the best possible way. It's like prog telex or something.
Yeah, nice, yeah.
In that sense, right?
Mm. Yeah, Walk Into Light might be an interesting compromise as well.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard that one, so I'll give that a gaze. Why not?
You know, at least I personally am a big champion of A. It's among my favorite Tull albums. I guess by default it's my favorite Tull album of the 80s, but the only one of the 80s, the only other one I like from the 80s is actually Under Wraps. I'm not a Broadsword and the Beast guy. I don't think that's very good. That's my contrarian opinion in the Tull world. The one that isn't, you mentioned Pleb in regard to Aqualung. For what it's worth, as much as I love a lot of Tull albums, including Rooster Branches, I mentioned Stormwatch, Songs in the Wood, my favourite is still probably actually, I think Aqualung is a brilliant album.
Yeah.
Slightly underrated in the grand scheme of things, because people talk about it as like, you know, it's just some prog cliche. But I actually think it's like a really like extraordinary, I don't even think of it as it's a prog album, but I tend to think of it as like one of those
hard rock.
brilliant sort of like good rockist albums at the time, like the Stones and the Who.
Sure,
it's like a very it does the Who almost better than the Who at times. Like in terms of like the sort of emotive sort of songwriting about like individual subjects.
Yeah,
like it's really like it's as good as or better than Townsend sometimes.
Sure,
in that respect, and that sort of didactic but kind of
Yeah,
easy to appreciate.
Didactic's
sense.
a good word that I was trying to think of for, because Pete Townsend's sort of like that as well.
Oh yeah. But sometimes you don't mind, like on Quadrophenia.
Which is how I feel about Ian
Or
Anderson
by
too.
numbers.
Yeah, no, the Pete Townsend and Ian Anderson I think of in very similar terms. Yeah,
Cool, yeah,
they're sort of
yeah.
similar in that sense, for sure.
Yeah, and obviously, like, the amount of bands of that age group would have, like, revered The Who is, like, insane, you know what I mean? And, like, seeing Townshend as a genius.
Oh, yeah. They're the ones who invented smashing the guitar.
Well, wasn't it, we listened to Martin Newell's Oddcast, and at one point, because he played a Who song before that, he said, oh, you know, I remember, like, a lot of my mates, you know, they had pictures of girls or pictures of footballers up on their wall. I had pictures of The Who. I thought they were the coolest people in the world.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. Do you want to move on to your next pick now? I think we're done. I'm done with Tull, actually, for now. We talked about them for a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. My next one is a Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, Rock and Roll with the Modern Lovers. There's a weird sort of... Like, up until very recently, only thought the Modern Lovers had one album. You know, I thought they were just this band that came along with this, like, art poppy little proto-punk album that I thought was kind of cool, you know, has a few good songs on it. Decent little garagey sort of, proto-punk sort of thing, right? But then I found out they have a few other albums, seemingly enough, and that, like, Jonathan Richman tried to be some, like, kind of, like, American folk troubadour for a while. And so it actually came up because these two, like, older people I work with brought up a song in this called Egyptian Reggae, and they're like, oh, man, you couldn't get away with that today. It's just like an instrumental that does like a little like, you know, the Arabic guitar thing or whatever.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, this song's awesome. And so I listened to the album, and I don't know, at certain points in recently, and I guess in the show as well, I've tried to like sort of track the history of where that sort of like slacker DIY music came from.
Yeah.
And somehow like it was weird that this existed that whole time, but I just for some reason had never heard of it or whatever, and when I first heard it straight away, I was able to sort of identify where so many of those later tropes came from. And funnily enough, you know, obviously things like the Beach Boys and, you know, Kevin Ayers or Syd Barrett, a bunch of like those sort of people. But I never thought it would have come from like a New York band, Jonathan Richman or whatever. And when I first heard this, I was just like, something about like the home recording and then the sort of like polyharmonies of like the band singing in an off-key, seemingly like middle American sounding accent. It sort of reminded me of like the sad version of Smiley Smile. I was like, man, this album just sounds like Frowny Frown. And I don't know, to me it just sounded like the first example like of a Midwest sort of emo album, because they all did that sort of thing later, those sort of like very almost whiny-ish like middle American accent polyharmonies, and then just like innocent little like kid songs about things like the wheels on the bus or the ice cream man, you know. And yeah, there's just, I don't know, this album's a weird mixture of just simple, like, sort of like old school, just rock tropes, sort of done in like a home job recording way that's, yeah, it mixes with just like pure pop, like melodies, and it has like the innocence of just like children's music, but done in a very sort of like all ages sort of way, you know. It's almost what I do like the Paul McCartney Ram album, but I kind of wish it was more like this or something like that, you know. Just that sort of, because you know Paul McCartney always tries to write these sort of innocent sounding pop songs, but they also get caught down in a bit of like a didactic sort of thing as well, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, like what's more didactic than referencing the Mother Mary in like a song or something?
Yeah, I was
even
a biggest Let It Be fan.
yeah, even though that is a thing that apparently
Maybe
actually,
when I was younger, but it sounds so hackneyed and contrived now. I can't really get behind it.
yeah, in a like a sort of pseudo sophisticated way that this album seems to consciously just like strip back everything from and just keep the core elements, you know. And yeah, it's just a short little like sort of emotive, innocent, interesting sort of like DIY listen I felt. And weirdly, like, even though, I don't know, like, because one of the mates who mentioned it existed was like a big Modern Lovers fan, probably the only one I've ever met, and he's from back in the day. And I was like, man, this is like, yeah, like, one of these like sort of quasi-depressing, innocent slacker albums. And he's like, yeah, it's always been that. I was like, oh, I just didn't know it existed. That's interesting. But in like his mind from back in the day, this has like always been there. So you can understand where things come in later, and it's just like, oh, whatever, I heard that 15 years ago, you know. But yeah, in the grand scheme of things, has maybe been a bit lost to it, or at least overshadowed by their first album, right? Like, had you ever heard that they had other albums?
I wasn't that familiar with it, no.
Yeah. It just sort of, I asked my little brother, and he was like, oh yeah, no, they've got other albums. I was just like, yeah, I guess, like, I always liked that first album, but was never like huge into the band or anything. But yeah, this, I guess it's not the same band. It's just Jonathan Richman with a bunch of new people.
Yeah, well, the reason people don't know is because, well, it's just if you go to any profiling of the group on websites, they'll have the Modern Lovers, and it'll show them having one album, and also this 1981, the original Modern Lovers. I guess it's some sort of archive.
Yeah.
But then you have to go to a separate page to find Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers and find albums which were released from 76 to 88. And no, I wasn't that familiar with them. I always quite liked the Modern Lovers album. I was never overly enamored with it, but I thought it was quite good. Very slick production. Fairly punchy and definitely likable. It was never a classic in my mind, but like I never had, you know,
sort of the same.
I never had a knee-jerk reaction to people saying it was. I just, yeah, it's a good album, very good album. So that's fine. If it's acclaimed, I guess so be it, you know. But yeah, and so I'd never heard this thing, obviously, and I'm listening to it, and yeah, like this isn't really my thing. I don't mind it. It's fine, but like, you know, sort of playful, innocent sort of, you know, basic rock and roll, you know, doing like Ice Cream Man and things like that. I mean, it's just not what I really gravitate toward listening to. I mean, I can appreciate that these guys, you know, found a lot of endearment in this sort of world, but yeah, it's just a bit American, a bit sort of like old world for me. I guess it's just I didn't find it overwhelmingly captivating, not unpleasant really, but it's just not the sort of thing that I would have really put on or you know, probably listen to in full. I mean, maybe listen to in full just out of respect, but like you know, like if we weren't doing Mandala, like it's just not the world I really travel down very much, frankly. That's more my take. That's my basic take. I don't know if I have much else to share. If I'm not, you know, I don't want to be too just, you know, because that's really all I have to say for the most part, actually. That being said, what I do quite admire is this, rather than, because obviously Modern Lovers, from what I understand, having disbanded in 74, but the album itself was released in 76, gained a bit of critical cred, and this album's from 77. Rather than going for like sort of the route of the sort of polished sort of curator, sort of, you know, vaguely bad boy rock and roll, as sort of the Ramones might have been doing at that time, Jonathan Richman instead goes for sort of the more playful innocence. He kind of does what the more mainstream maybe sort of sneered at in this world. Power pop acts
Yeah,
like
they
Cheap Trick
definitely
are
would have
doing.
sneered at the for sure.
What Status Quo are doing over in the UK. But like to Richmond, this is an organic step from where he was at in the more sort of critically manicured modern lovers. Although obviously some might look at the Ramones now as sounding like a boy band if they're removed from the context of like the 70s and the New York scene and things like that. Our modern listeners heard Blitzkrieg Bop on a Rugrats soundtrack perhaps, but no, what Richmond did here was sort of he rooted his sort of love of rock and roll not in sort of this like dangerous sort of edgy world, but in sort of dancing in the gym room, in your socks sort of mode, which is sort of a bold thing to do, I believe, at this time, and it's sort of seemingly inviting the New York press to sort of turn your nose up and say you're not as cool as Richard Hell or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
He didn't mind, clearly.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought, because that's sort of how I felt about the album as well, at least, because it's probably not my favorite thing ever. I sort of mostly appreciate it as like a sort of, like the sort of artifact that it is, and one that is completely lacking in artifice, and just sort of mostly the quality in it, I feel, is the simplicity rather than like the sort of extraneous things that they would have added on to the more critically, like the world of this sort of rock music that was looking at the New York critics or looking at what's it called, the Village Voice or something like that, Yeah, it's sort of just like a case of retreating from the industry more than anything else. Yeah.
But weirdly, potentially appealing to the industry more as well. Like, this could have found I don't know if it's particular or niche enough that it couldn't have found, because obviously stuff like, as I said, Cheap Trick was very big, but that's very big and produced music. This is a little more minimal by comparison.
Yeah.
So maybe it couldn't have found like a more mainstream audience if it had the exposure. I don't know. It's interesting to think about though. Anyway, if we've got if that's the extent of what
what's the next one we got?
Richmond. My pick here is Gamma Free.
Rush 2.
Gamma's an interesting thing. So Gamma splits off of a more well-known band called Montrose from the early 70s. And
they were huge, seemingly. They're probably, well, not huge, but one of the biggest of these hard rock bands that I never heard of until I was in like my 20s.
Okay, yeah.
Because you just heard about all the other ones through like just general, cultural osmosis or whatever.
Yeah.
But Montrose sort of seemed like, are they American?
Yeah, that's the thing.
It seems like very American, where it didn't get to Australia via Britain,
Well, that's the thing. You can read perspectives from British, I guess, heavy metal / early heavy metal fans in the early 70s. All the music they listened to was from England. Zeppelin, Deep Purple,
Yeah.
Sabbath, all these...
all the early hard rock, the first wave is, even Heap, they're English, right?
Exactly, yeah. All coming from the UK. And then, all of a sudden, some of them said that one day...
Hendrix is American, isn't he? But he went to the UK.
Yeah, the band itself, Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding are British.
Yeah.
Obviously Cream earlier than that.
Yeah.
But then you had, from America, this band called Montrose, and apparently from certain British fans' perspective, this was like the first American band that they heard that were doing this sort of thing. Montrose's album came out in 1973, which some people say is one of the heavier, at least of American albums of the 1970s.
Okay, so heavier than Grand Funk.
Yeah. I don't think people consider those to be tremendously heavy.
No, I think maybe at the time, but these days, no.
No, not at all. But so what Gamma was Montrose didn't work out in the long run. Montrose is relatively famous for being the band which Sammy Hagar was first in, who later had the solo career and was then the second vocalist for Van Halen.
Wow.
And it's interesting because...
I was going to evoke Sammy Hagar at some point.
Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen himself was a huge Montrose fan, and so it was fitting, I guess, for him, but he got Sammy Hagar as vocalist later. But anyway, Gamma was formed in 1979. They released, this is Ronnie Montrose from Montrose founding his new band, and they released their first album in 1979, their second album in 1980, and this one, Gamma Free, 1982. Now, I have to admit, like, I've heard a little bit of the Montrose album. It's not the sort of, it's sort of the more bluesy American hard rock that I'm more interested in, sort of the English virtuoso keyboard or sort of like horror occult stuff that Sabbath are doing, for instance. I'm not as overwhelmingly excited about the Montrose album. But the reason I became aware of Gamma Free is because the Canadian heavy metal music critic Martin Popoff would talk a lot on the Contrarian shows and on the Popoff and Pardo in the Morning on SOT about how much he loves Gamma, and in particular Gamma Free. And he said Gamma Free is sort of derided by the fan base, but it incorporates keyboards and synthesizers.
Oh, so the first two don't have that like rushy synth prog sound?
Apparently, no.
Okay.
From what I've sampled of at least Gamma 2, it doesn't. It's a fairly classy hard rock album for what it is, but it doesn't incorporate many synths.
Honestly, when you said they were formed in 79, I thought maybe that was just his whole MO for starting this band, was to incorporate newer like tech into hard rock, but no, not even.
Not necessarily. I don't think so.
Okay.
And, I mean, Ronnie Montrose is always known as, I guess, a gearhead, which made his transitioning into the synthesizer part, Cyborg Act, sort of make a bit of sense from his perspective, but I guess from the sort of raw sort of, you know, blues, hard rock fans, you know, they weren't having it. And but Popoff will talk about how he not only loves Gamma Free, but he thinks it's the best thing they ever did. And he's talking about how great a production it is, and how he listens to it over and over again. I was like, yeah, I might check out Gamma Free, because, you know, I like the idea of this sort of very sort of intricate and classy, polished, like early 80s hard rock production, but with like a lot of like synthesizer care. I mean, you mentioned Rush. I'm a big fan of Rush around that time.
Yeah, they do that sound very well.
As is Popoff. So I was like, well, maybe I'll check out Gamma. And the opening track, What's Gone Is Gone. You know, I ended up listening to that quite a few times, and it is a very conventional, slightly AOR song, but in the best possible way. It's like, if that genre could be good, and there are a few songs that one can't help but enjoy in that sort of mold, like take that Jenny 8675309 song. I think it's kind of fun in its own stupid way.
Which one, sorry?
You know, Tommy Two Tone, Jenny, I Got Your Number, 8675309.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of like that song.
Yeah, for sure. It's like the opposite of like...
Good time call.
Like I was going to say, the aspects of this album that bogged it down for me were those, what did you say, AOR? Like Sammy Hagar, you know that song like, I Can't Drive If... And I'm rocking and I'm rolling.
Yeah.
But that first track is, like you said, it's that just done... I don't know, it's even got the same sort of proggy, like, you know, tempo changes and stuff, but it's done in, like, the most just pop way, that it's not, like, jarring, you know, they happen in such a smooth fashion that it really works, you know, it may as well be, like, a big music song in that sense.
Yeah, no, it is a bit big music. So you mentioned big music, because one of the best things about this album, in my opinion, I think it's an extraordinary showcase of great 80s vocal performances. Davey Patterson here is extraordinary. He hails from Scotland, actually.
Okay.
And I think his work on here is incredible. I mean,
he's like a less screechy Geddy Lee. You know, he has that same sort of high, very, very high, but not as high as like John Anderson, but, you know, doesn't have the same sort of... It seems like he has a bit more vocal training, let's say, than Geddy Lee.
Yeah. It's a sort of, like, it's just a really careful, considerate production, and I actually think for the most part, very most part, it even though it's like a synthesizer experiment, it's not, and there are commercial components to it or melodic components to it, but a lot of the tracks on here, sometimes it's like hi-fi minimal synth, like they really go for it in terms of like sonic effects and like electronic washes over the songs. I remember there was a few songs there are very taken by how like seemingly daring they are. Maybe, I mean, Rush were doing similar things, so maybe it's only so daring. Like this was a relatively mainstream sound for like a hard rock band. It's
the instrumental
unusual to
sections
hear.
are more adventurous, definitely. Where, like I said before, just to my sensibilities, it gets bogged down a bit. Is just that sort of the tropes of the AOR like songwriting, and that's more so in like. A few of the songs in like the middle of the album. I don't quite remember the track list, but it just gets into a bit of the same sort of like riffing and stuff like that is very typical of the genre. But every time it has like touches of like synth stabs and washes, and very like similar to, once again, to keep comparing it to Rush, but that's sort of very like, you know, Neil Peart would sort of incorporate the Trevor Horn-esque elements of the drum sonic palette in the 80s. It's got like some of that as well, you know. whilst also maintaining the sort of traditional acoustic kit. It sort of blends both, right? But yeah, the opening track might be where it shines the brightest, though. I remember there was one other song in there which was like, I think it was instrumental even. It was very adventurous in like the same sort of way that one of those Camel songs was on
Single Factor?
no.
Oh, I Can
House
See a
Up
House in
Here.
Here.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, I can't believe that was on here.
But yeah, it's you mentioned the drum sound. The drum sound's one of the things I love the most about it. I think it's extraordinary.
The cymbals are very clear. Yeah, for sure. The ride cymbal production is great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of these I do like have a vague soft spot for that early 80s AOR to an extent. Like there's a couple of those like corny tracks from that Sports Huey Lewis album which are kind of fun to my ears, like I Want a New Drug, which Ghostbusters fame allegedly stole.
Well, these sort of songs, they're fun in like low key parties, you know. Like one of these songs, or Huey Lewis will come on at just like a family event, and it's like a good time, you know, because no one's not really. It's not like a gig where the music is the focus. It's like a sort of party atmosphere, sort of background.
Yeah, like it's. But yeah, in terms of like the kind of old school sort of like dad rockist sort of like production dimension, you know, that sort of thing can get kind of weary when we're just talking about sort of guitars and wall of sounds and that annoying George Harrison All Things Must Pass sort of gross fucking, you know, you just stereo system crap.
Yeah.
You know, like
Mellotron core.
Like Gamma and Ronnie Montrose, I guess, is downstream of that sort of like 70s sort of like audiophile sort of like stereo system, insular, sort of antisocial, but, you know, like sort of not interested in the outside world. I guess that's why I use the word insular world, but it incorporates the very interesting sort of active, at that time very populist, like and sort of actively engaging, not just sort of like, yes, I like what the textures are going on.
Yeah,
like,
that's sort of what I think I was trying to point out. Yeah.
It actually like meets both worlds, meets the two worlds halfway, and I quite really appreciate Gamma Free for that. I wanted to pick Gamma Free because I've always been a fan of the song, since I've mentioned the story, how I found it, What's Gone Is Gone, and I figured in doing an 80s show, wouldn't it be great to like actually, you know, see how this album holds as an entire piece, and if it does, if the opening track is indicator of anything, I think it'll be a great Mandala pick for the 80s thing.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I found it worthy to sort of champion here. This is my, you know, far from sort of one of these sort of audiophile stereo system boomers, but as a, you know, younger person, like, you know, I think this is terrific, good stuff.
Yeah, like it is a bit eclectic for that crowd.
Yeah,
that's probably why it wasn't, you know, White Snake or
well, of course,
you know.
Yeah.
It and you said it's sort of derided by fans of the band even.
Seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Not all, but like enough. I've heard that before.
Because it's interesting when a band like this tries to do something a bit more adventurous. They like with the Tull choice, right? There seems to be a sort of backlash.
Yeah, definitely. And well, it's the same thing with Rush. A lot of those old 70s Rush fans still kind of bemoan a lot of the mid-80s stuff.
Yeah, it seems like the newer Rush fans are more fans of that stuff than the older ones, yeah.
Yeah, whereas my 4 favourite Rush albums are Moving Pictures through to Power Windows. That's where I'm at with the group. And I love pretty much most of what they did over the decades, but if I had to narrow it down, 81 to 85, you know. That's my you know. But yeah, like really cool little item here. I'd like to explore. Maybe they're probably not going to sound as similar to Gamma Free, but maybe out of respect, one day I would spend more time with Gamma 1 and Gamma 2. What I have heard of Gamma 2, it does seem like quite a good, like, interesting hard rock release. Like, you know, like, some of these guitarists could do things where the songs themselves are more, like, they weren't interested in verse. They're interested in verse choruses insofar as they wanted to compose songs, but they were more interested in, these things holding up as interesting instrumentals, I guess, first and foremost, and they sort of have a hired vocalist to like put their stuff on top of it. You know, and then Ronnie Montrose is a bit like Jeff Beck in this respect, whereas Jeff Beck's sort of straightforward hard rock songs from like say the late 60s are way more interesting than anyone else's for like the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Ronnie Montrose being a sort of virtuoso musician in this respect, really good, because I think even someone like Eddie Van Halen, like you always have to have, you know, David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar to help him write the songs, and frankly those two guys aren't the greatest songwriters in this world.
Sure.
I don't hate David Lee Roth or Van Halen, like some of it's fun, but you know, it's very, very basic, and a lot of it's covers, obviously.
Yeah.
So some songwriter, but you know, anyway, that's my take on Gamma Free.
Yeah.
Fairly straightforward album, but like I like that about it. I think it's just a very sleek sort of, for one of those like sort of stereo system albums. I think it's really punchy and
It would easily have
slick.
to be like one of the best of this sort of genre. Like I'm not overly familiar with the genre just because it's not my thing, but it seems like this one would be like have to be one of the top ones, right?
Well, yeah, like I can't imagine like this is literally listed as AOR on Rate Your Music, for instance.
Sure.
And like, you know, the other sort of AOR albums are, you know, like groups like Boston, Unruly Child, Bob Catley, Magnum, Mark Free, Red Dawn, Boulevard Signal, Hardline, Kane Roberts. I don't know. I literally don't know what half of this stuff is.
Neither do I.
Actually, I thought it was going to be more like, you know, Styx, Huey Lewis.
Yeah,
sort of
me
like
too.
Journey, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
What are they called? You know, Don't Stop Believing.
That's Journey.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Journey. I thought you said someone else.
Okay,
Or
yeah,
like,
Survivor's listed here. That's
Foreigner.
one of them. Foreigner, yeah, exactly.
Survivor, man. Oh.
I don't know half of these bands. Holy crap. I thought these were like huge bands in the 80s, but they've got a lot of like neo stuff from like the 2000s.
Oh wow. Okay.
I was aware it existed. I didn't think anyone would be.
And then people are saying, "Oh, they're actually good."
People like AOR, I guess, because who else is clicking on it? No one else knows it exists. So
Americans seem to really like AOR.
yeah, like the really popular stuff, not this sort of like subcultural exclusive stuff.
No.
It seems.
Yeah. I was meant like Journey and whatnot.
Yeah, I can't stand that stuff. But unless it's Gamma, I guess. Anyway, want to move back to New Zealand for this one?
Yeah, about as far back as you can go, I suppose. We've got the Patia Maori Club, Hoi. I'm terrible with pronunciations of Maori words because they're quite hard to pronounce, but it's a beautiful culture. I don't know a lot about it other than they were warlike people, very mystical, had a sort of seemingly conscious view of like the ecological view of the world around them. Like I remember reading once they found these like parrots that would preserve seeds in water. So they like copied the parrots to start sort of a rudimentary farming system doing the same method. I thought that was kind of funny. Or like curious, you know, just at least observing what the parrots are doing. But anyway, in the case of this album, I guess I bring this up because it sort of starts as a progressive electronic, almost like ethnographic album of like just traditional Maori songs and stuff done over like, you know, those deep wash sort of synth stuff. It's more emphasized the Maori music than the synth stuff. That's just sort of the backdrop to it, you know. And you just get these sort of traditional, very vocal, like rhythmic sort of songs that, and then like little bits of the mythology or whatever. It's mostly just aesthetic. It's not really a history lesson or anything. And then I could see where maybe a lot of people would just be sort of bored or not interested in the more like ethnographic aspects of the first half of the album. But then the second part, side of the album is like space synthy, like R&B disco sort of music. Then once again done with the Maori stuff over it, and it's such like a rich blend of both like the traditional songs and just like I don't know, sort of middle of the road-ish like spiritual R&B from the time. And it's just a simple sort of fruitful blend of like musical elements, you know, that sort of lends itself weirdly well to those like they sort of take out the rhythm of those earlier songs on the first and they give the more melodic songs the sort of rhythmic R&B backdrop, you know. And I don't know, it's a cool sort of flavor. It really does blend, yeah, very naturally at least. There's a few songs right at the end of the album, like Noi Noi, that just like it's one of those things that like if it was released in like Germany or like Austria in like the late 70s, it would have been like a Boney M level like hit, you know. One of those sort of things, you know. I sort of, once again, this is another one I just found going through like a list of New Zealand albums, because a lot of them are very like barely rated on the RYM aggregate. You know, they may have like 50 ratings or something, probably all New Zealanders. Even though apparently this was like the biggest album of its day in like the late 80s over there. Like everyone had a copy. The government issued it to you, you know. And I guess mostly the reason why I wanted to listen to it initially was a classic do judge an album by its cover, because straight away seeing it, I was just like, yeah, this has to be good no
You
matter
can at
what.
least gauge the genre.
Or at least gauge the genre. And
Or in the case of Asia, which genre its band members came from. That's another case of an AOR band, but they tried to hide it with the sleeves, didn't they?
yeah, they tried to pretend it was still like Steve Howe.
Though Journey had fairly proggy sleeves for what they were.
Yeah, they've got like the spaceships and stuff like that,
Yeah, well, that's always annoyed me about them.
Yeah, no, for sure. Those AOR bands like Asia and Journey would sort of keep that there. Yeah.
Obviously Styx did too, but they, are more proggy than most of those groups.
More like
in their
slightly art school, in the more...
earlier on, at least.
Yeah. In the sort of like ELO or like Ian Anderson sort of way,
Yeah. But anyway, keep going, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, I was, yeah, I don't know. There's something about the album. It feels like it was trying to be popular, like the thing that would be issued to everybody in New Zealand, but for a purpose. The purpose being a sort of like, as an ethnographic, like, anthropological artifact done by Maori people, to sort of even maybe get to the youth, so the culture doesn't die and stuff like that.
Cultural pride, optimism, and like a sort of a shared appreciation of everyone living on that island.
And because you don't get taught these things at school, so even if you are a Maori kid, they're not going to teach you the Maori songs and stuff.
Sure, yeah.
It's literally to keep the culture alive and going, as well as pride. Because, like in the case of Australia, and it's probably similar in New Zealand. Oh no, I think they have a unified language over the whole, maybe not both islands. I'm not exactly sure, but there's been a lot of like lost languages in Australia.
Yes, lots.
Which I think less so affects the Maori. And language, like we've probably talked about before, it is a big deal in that sort of cultural, artifactual sense. Even in the themes of Metal Gear Solid 5 or whatever.
Yes, yeah.
Like that's a core theme, right?
Yeah.
It is very appropriate. Like it is functional in the sort of sense of the world we live in now as the world village or whatever, to have one sort of universal business language or communication language or whatever. But it is also sort of important to preserve all disparate cultures, because it's good to have the one sort of universal communicative language to then break all those barriers, but then to keep all the other ones as well, for various reasons, if not just to collect the logos, Yeah, I don't know. That's sort of what I thought about this album.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts on this one here. Wow, like being exposed to this, I was super excited. God Almighty, it's like this is, unless there's something earlier, like this is obviously it's a different sort of context, but it's almost New Zealand's answer to Cybertron's first release, which is to say this big sort of at that time very forward-thinking electronic statement, very a lot more pop than I imagine the Cybertron album would be considered, even in the 70s.
Yeah.
Though people were buying Tangerine Dream albums, what I can understand.
They sold in Australia like hotcakes.
Yeah, so maybe Cybertron would sell, especially because they're from Melbourne, so maybe even in a place like that it did decent business. I mean, they put out a second and third album, so people must have bought them.
Yeah.
To be fair. But what I mean is, like, Cybertron evokes sort of like a very prehistorical sort of eternal, everything occurring at once in the same point in time notion of Australia. It's very you can think of like prehistoric mammals wandering about. The drones are reminiscent of like the Aboriginal traditional music times, and even sort of like titles like Arrakis evoking the desert. Like what continent best is an analog in its landscapes to Frank Herbert's Dune than Australia.
Australia and just the Arabian Peninsula, but that's not a whole continent, that's just one peninsula. But yeah, Australia is the other closest, right? Maybe North Africa, but those are the three big deserts of the world, right?
Because you think of the American deserts and they don't quite match what you think of when you think of Arrakis.
No, not quite. They are in the southwest pretty vast, but not quite to the same degree, I don't think. They're more like arid and rocky, I think, whereas Australian deserts are very sparse, same as the Sahara and the Arabian desert. They're just endless dunes sort of thing. Well, actually, they're more dunes, whereas Australia is weirdly flat. Although there are quite a lot of dunes, actually. But they're not like the vast dunes you see in, documentary footage of, Arabia.
Or
right?
Lawrence of Arabia.
Or the movie itself, yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it's such an incredible, fun, listenable thing. But it's also very sort of rich as a sonic project. God, there's few albums that may be more likable than this one. It's just such a. So what's interesting is that, correct me if I'm in a bit of error here.
No.
The single preceded the album, right? The
Maybe,
Poi E, the single itself,
It-
was like sort of this smash single, and then this sort of album was maybe produced around it.
I think that is the case. That's sort of what people I asked from New Zealand that I work with, a couple of them, yeah, they were like, there was a big song, Poi.
Because from what I understand, at least in New Zealand, amongst like a certain, like maybe amongst like the older generation / the national broadcaster context, I think the song Poi is still like quite well remembered as like this little fun moment in time, at least.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like New Zealand's first foray into hip hop, in a way that Australia doesn't really have a foray into hip hop in the same way.
Yeah,
I guess I don't know if our traditional custodians, our indigenous population, ever engaged in hip hop, or if there's really
there's a bit of it
successful
these
hip-hop act around
days,
this
but I'm
time.
not sure about
Yeah,
it at the
these
time.
days, but at that time, I don't know if there were
It's-
indigenous music acts.
They were
like
doing
Yothu
more
Yindi.
like
It
mixtures.
was more world beat, wasn't it? Though.
Yothu Yindi's world, they would do world beat and then also, rootsy or bluesy sort of country-esque music mixed with traditional music, like Warumbi Band.
Yeah.
They're a classic case of that. And then a bit of the mixing like progressive electronic with didgeridoos and stuff and pub rock, like God in Wonderland.
Mhm.
They were sort of downstream of like country and rock music, doing
Yeah.
different things, mixing like that traditional music with it. Whereas, I've never thought about that. I don't know when like indigenous hip hop would have started.
Because this obviously sort of Maori influenced hip hop. It was very organic,
Apparently, the Maori and the Polynesian people just love like R&B and were very early to hip hop because of that. And that was just like the big thing at the time. And then did love like experimental R&B and like all that sort of synthy stuff too. Yeah, for sure. And like sort of soul music. They call it like Soul Polynesia or something like that. I forget what it's called, but there is a sort of style, like, they consider like Polynesian soul sort of music, which makes sense that then, because the Aboriginal stuff is more in line with like sort of rock than soul, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, like what we have here is it's something. God, I might call it a masterpiece. Even it's just like so organic, fluid, sort of like unpretentious, like very populist, but not remotely condescending. Like, it's so high and sort of like confident and convicted in its creativity. Doesn't like it's not like. If it sounds simplistic, that's just because the genre evolved tremendously. Or not, which is to say the genre got better or worse. That's subjective, but like
the tech got better.
It got a lot more intricate, and this is very early days of this genre. Like, and even obviously compared to American hip hop at the time, which got a fair bit more complicated than this. At least the year after, the '88, there's some seminal American, mostly East Coast, I think, hip hop, which is just blew the previous acts of the decade out of the water, like, ultramagnetic MCs or EPMD previously discussed on this program.
Sure, yeah.
So it is sort of easy for a very casual listener to think that it's a bit, like, poppy or, like, deliberately straightforward. But no, this is extremely cutting edge in 1987, and especially in that particular corner of the world that we're not very far removed from, actually.
Sure, yeah.
Like, no, there's nothing in Australia remotely like this around this time, that's for sure. At least nothing good.
Not off the top of my head.
I mean, there's that bizarre, like, marsupial rap from the early 70s, but that doesn't count.
Yeah, that's more of a novelty song.
That's funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, brilliant. This is, like, one of the very best New Zealand albums I've ever heard. I mean, it's up there with, Submarine Bells and, God, what else is there? I don't know, some other stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the other stuff later on this show, maybe.
Nice.
And earlier, to be fair.
But yeah, no, I agree. I'm glad I started going through that list again, or was adding things onto the list I was making, because I was just like, this shit like this, I always hoped existed, and I'm glad it does.
Oh, some of the best New Zealand music, actually. Unknown Mortal Orchestra, good stuff.
Yeah, nice.
They're quite well known.
Yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
Anyway, is that our spiels on Pattaya Maori Club?
Yeah.
If we're going to recommend any album on this program, not just because of its quality, but that too, but just because it's going to be one of the most immediately likable for any audience, certainly younger-ish. Well, people our age or a bit older, people older than this album significantly older than this album's release, maybe they don't like hip hop at all, and maybe people a bit too younger than us will think it's too like old school. But there's a certain like 20-year block where like if you're born in, like, you'll dig this album a hell of a lot, without a doubt. But anyway, so what we're going to move on to now, I suppose, is a little daunting. So I guess I'll just take it one step at a time and try to fulfill a little like sort of joke challenge offered off the air. But I will mention someone else, which is still cheating a little bit. But so you know how the part of the first few albums I picked ever on Mandala, as I mentioned earlier, Associates, OMD, John Fox, and Wire. The first 4 picks in that show. The 5th was contemporary release. Was Little Boy Velvet's Pick Me, actually. Why I picked those 80s albums, other than them being good albums, is because I wanted to sort of like push this new narrative. It's not new, I'm sure, which is good. It's good that it's not new, but I do want to reiterate it, that like these classic LPs and the idea of the LP is like this very considered piece of art, and not like just a venue for like, we'll put the singles at the start and then we'll just put a bunch of filler and like a bunch of the rest of it. A lot of very mainstream pop acts, yes, that's how their albums were, of course.
About 75%, but yeah.
But where some of these groups were concerned, they put the most accessible sort of bouncy songs from the sessions as the single, but those sessions were some of the most experimental, like cutting edge, forward thinking of their time. These guys were very serious about creating an experience, and sort of even if it was sort of 3 to 4 minute song oriented, and like it wasn't interested in long prog virtuoso suites. Excuse me, sorry.
And a bit more rhythm centric as well, or at least in the like proto electronic hip hop way that prog doesn't have at all. It's more in a classical sort of sense. This one will balance quirky drum patterns over all these strange like wonky synths and stuff. Yeah, it's more indicative of what like music became later, right?
Yeah, as everyone can tell from the image, it's Japan's tin drums what I'm talking about, and it's very much in the vein of why I love or want to champion albums like those I mentioned from Associates, John Fox, OMD, is because especially in this very early part, in like the first half of the 80s, it arguably kind of splinters away in the later part of the decade as these sort of alternative acts sort of move away, disband, or become incorporated in sort of the big mainstream structures.
They all try to break America as well.
That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But with tin drum in Japan, it's as considered and sort of, I guess, like sort of cerebrally ambitious as any of the sort of big 70s LPs in a sort of trip sense. But it wants to kind of take you on a voyage through sonic experiments, sort of psychological perspectives, and existential propositions. It's one of the most sincere and effective acts of existential polemic in the English language, and possibly in pop music today. Like I think this competes with like there's a certain, I'm saying off air, like as beautiful and as powerful as some of David Bowie's most soulful sort of confessional lyricism is, there's a degree to which, and this is also, there's a reason it may be more effective in the earlier part of his career, up to like Hunky Dory or Aladdin Sane-ish, say, like in terms of that sort of material, is because Bowie is sort of this high and mighty sort of like elite club celebrity, sort of like, there was always a degree to which like Bowie's existentialism felt a bit hollow after a point, because he was unaware of just how like ubermensch he'd become, and he used to write, sort of like in a very merry, playful, sort of bizarre way about what it would be like to be one of the ubermensch and Hunky Dory. But then once he became one, he became sort of, certainly less interesting as a existential character. The music itself, especially given his collaborators, tended to be incredibly interesting. Like even some of that 90s and 21st century Bowie, it's quite good stuff. But something was a bit, I think, missing, because he could not see himself as this sort of icon, I feel, after all.
Nah,
And
definitely.
maybe that's what he wanted, but in a sort of Andy Warhol sense. I mean, he wrote a song about Warhol famously, but
Yeah.
so be it.
That's
then.
probably what he wanted at that time, but then definitely felt burdened by it through the 90s and 2000s. You do feel, or at least you see a bit in interviews, but you hear a bit in the music.
Yeah.
You know.
That's probably fair to say. Whereas, of course, our man David Sylvian on this album, Japan were a relatively popular group, but not like, smash superstars. And Sylvian sort of dealing...
Nearly, but not quite.
But the thing about Sylvian is he's got a lot of pressure on him to be sort of this superstar of this potentially quite big band. But, I mean, does he strike you from his lyrics or from his appearance as someone who is necessarily poised or can really deal with the prospect of stardom, or is even, potentially gonna fit into that world, accepted by the masses in that respect? He's not gonna be a Brian Ferry, he's not gonna be a Bowie, and he's not even gonna be David Byrne.
That's true, but that was the sort of that gothic sort of haunted artist thing was a part of the aesthetic of some of those new romantic artists. You know?
Very true.
They're sort of echoing the heroin addiction of Samuel Coleridge or something like that. He does suit that a bit, similar to even someone I guess it's sort of proto new romantic, but the Teardrop Explodes guy, and also the psychedelic furs guy. I forget his name.
Hawley? No.
I
I
can't-
thought Richard Hawley's different.
Yeah, I always forget that guy's name, but it's sort of similar to that. They're like misanthropic romantics or something like that.
Something about
Sylvian's a bit like that to me, and the lyrics as well. But
Richard Butler.
okay, Richard Butler, yeah, that's it, yeah. Whereas I don't know, this album to me, it feels like maybe it is polemic in the sense of I feel it's sort of thematic conception of China and coming to terms with England's history of sort of Fu Manchuing China or whatever, especially in the wake of the opium era. And it's sort of, how I even read recently, funnily enough, a Simon Reynolds thing from The Wire in the 90s where he's talking about contemporary changing dance cliches and stuff like that in the late 90s. And he talks about I forget what it was called, but one of these new burgeoning genres that month or whatever took elements of what he called the Orientalism of angular early synth pop. And that's what I feel because so much of that uses the Oriental riff and stuff like that, and that's sort of what this album does, but to its most warped and artful, trying to in a respectful way. It feels like there's a sort of respect for the Orient that this album has that might be commenting on England's history with it or something like that, as well as his own inner ghosts or whatever. But maybe even that's tied into it, because I think there's a lot of metaphors to do with British opium in the Orient and ghosts, right? They sort of considered a haunting or an event, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking about that listening to this album again recently, especially after reading that thing that little just quip he mentioned. And I was just it feels like this album has a respect for that sort of, it's not using the Orient tropes in a cliche way, right?
No,
It's similar to Eno does on Taking Tiger Mountain, right?
Yeah.
It feels very similar to that, and it just got me thinking about how China itself, right, is just one of the two cradles of civilization, but in a way it's, the word xenophobia, in its most literal sense, China's very xenophobic of the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is very xenophobic of China. There's always been a big divide between the cradles of civilization in that sense, to the point where it's,
Himalayas.
it's literal, big geographical divide caused that, of course, yeah. That's why you get, Journey to the West and Journey to the East, right? And, but it's xenophobia in not the opposite of the Hillary Clinton sense. It's in the most literal sense. We know nothing about each other, and there's very little sort of cultural exchange between the two outside of just tropes and mockery, right? I don't know. I felt this album was even maybe an attempt to bridge the gap,
I actually think the existentialism goes far beyond sort of national identities. I think
No, because I was just extrapolating on. You said it was a polemic.
But it's thoroughly transnational. It's more about
Well, that's what I was...
spaces and places in general. It's less that China was uniquely Chinese and therefore the British had to have it. It was sort of this space. They wanted this sort of this conundrum of, you know, not being happy in England and needing to sort of stretch your legs, you know, just plans for buildings and houses and mobile homes. Like there's just making plans for buildings in China. Like there's just all throughout the album is this you know, and even when he's projecting, you know, from an Englander's perspective, yeah, I guess a Cantonese boy.
To be honest, that song, the Mobile Homes one, it actually, that's the one that for some reason at least spoke to me in a way that's not conducive of the rest of the album. It feels more like ahead of its time and like now how people just travel, the whole grey nomads. Like going on holidays through Queensland. When I first heard that song, it felt like it was about that generation, somehow ahead of its time. Like, and also, you know, rent crises and stuff like that. Like, yeah, that one sort of, it almost feels like it's pulled out from the album and it's timeless in a sense.
It's timeless because it's always been a phenomenon. It's always been an existential trope of the more developed world. And you know, him writing a song about a Cantonese boy, like it's just the equivalent of like someone from China writing a song about what it might be like to live in England. It's just more about the other. How he happens to be English, and England China happens to be a huge that fits that sort of England scaffold of what the sort of exotic world outside of England is like. And then so they happen to be the nations in question. But I think the themes are so universal, and that's kind of why I think of it as like, you know, being more about the concept of just the existential drive, which you know, that like has people, you know, just constantly wanting to, you know, never being sort of content in one place. There's always like there's always more. There's always a desire to like kind of move and move and move. And what are we moving away from? The past. We're moving away from just the whole idea of ghosts of one's life. I mean, that's going to be one of my favorite metaphors for the human condition, and I think this is something so, like, Sylvian is probably a little bit younger than I am right now, like when he's recording this album, and like already there are things from like his childhood or his adolescence or even maybe mistakes he made as a young adult already that, like, you know, even if they're not known to anyone, you know, just like, you know, little trespasses with friends or conflicts with partners, romantic partners, like there's always going to be these things sort of like privately sort of chipping away at our brains, and whether we're willing to put them in song or not, you know, I guess that's up to the artist. But what happens with Sylvian here is, you know...
You're in the case of Mark Cos, like every fucking line.
There you go. Yeah, you know, he's very brave in that respect.
But yeah, Ghost of My Life, especially for the time, in a sort of proto-nihilistic ballad, is very, very, like, pure in that sense. Because it is, like, nihilism in the Camus sense, rather than in the, I don't know, Midwest emo sense.
Exactly, right? Yeah. He's coming from a place of, you know, 4 albums in, like, he can only, like, he probably had a thought one day, I don't know, maybe he had a thought one day, he before they had that first album out, he could only imagine what it would be like to be the sort of artist that was able to get 4 albums out. And then, you know, by 1980, they had the 4 albums out, and then he's still sort of, he's in such a privileged position in a world context, in a sense, and he's wondering sort of what's left, and he's thinking about, you know, what else is going on in the world. He's looking at the news, places like China and Asia in general, you know, horrible things have happened in Cambodia and Vietnam in the very recent news, obviously China as well, of course.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
And so it's him trying to grapple with this. It's the most compelling and legitimate existentialism in pop music, and I'm like, whereas Bowie was sort of reflecting on his own career in a really fascinating way, albeit on Scary Monsters, it doesn't relate to every person in the way that, and it's a fascinating fucking listen, just because no one has David Bowie's life, so it's interesting in that respect.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
Of course, like how Kanye West's albums are interesting now.
Yeah,
not the last. The last couple are a bit creepy, frankly.
Yeah.
Post the Donda was cool, but beyond that, when you got into the sort of far right shit, like the music suffered as well.
And even Donda's a bit hit and miss, you know.
I appreciate it, but I appreciated Pablo and even Ye more.
Yeah, Donda's like only good in the sense of it being so like schismatic. Like it's just.
I do want to listen to it more, to be fair. I know the second one was not very well received at all, though.
Oh, I started. It didn't sound good.
But yeah, like to me, David Sylvian's existentialism on Tin Drum is as like authentic as existentialism gets in pop music. We can talk about folk songwriters, we can talk about Kozilek, and we can talk about a wide spectrum of people who write very pure, stripped down songs.
Yeah,
but in terms
that's
of
not
the
pop,
commercial
though.
dimension of what we know as pop music, no one was more authentically existential.
Well, because this album
as Sylvian.
it's doing it in like the pop music sort of aesthetic of its time, the new romantic thing. So it's definitely pop music. It's like UK pop music right out of its time, but also timeless at the same time.
And Sylvian, this technically he was a pop star, like definitionally, you know, according to the record label, but he doesn't seem like sort of comfortable with that.
He wasn't a mega star, but he was a pop star for sure.
It seemed like he was sort of maybe intimidated by the prospect of having to live this very cordoned off life. And it's telling that the band, that apparently for sort of creative differences more so, the band split up right afterward. There's another album which people consider a de facto Japan album. I can't remember what that's called. Rain Tree Crow from 1983.
Oh yeah, he's a spin-off band. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, is that 91? This is 91.
Yeah, I've heard a bit of that. It was pretty good from what I heard.
Yeah,
but I
no,
haven't listened
same.
extensively though.
Yeah, and obviously Sylvian, or Mick Kahn, the bassist, he went on to do other stuff. And Sylvian has still solo albums, including one with Robert Fripp called The First Day, which is fantastic.
Okay.
And Sylvian's solo album that I would recommend actually is the one I'm most familiar with, other than The First Day, is the first one, 1984's Brilliant Trees, which is a lot less poppy than Tin Drum, but like, God, really, God, what's it describe? How would I describe it? Like bordering on early post rock even. It's considered art pop here. That's probably fair to say, but like, you know, it's, you know, for a guy who just done like pop albums to go straight to this is fascinating. No, Brilliant Trees is highly recommended.
Yeah, cool.
But also, you know, just in general, like, yeah, I can't. This is pop music at its most sort of purely sort of yeah, like just challenging one's concepts of stability and sort of like the potential rigidity of sort of the day-to-day. Like, most pop music is sort of conducive to a sort of lifestyle which lends itself to sort of market capitalism and sort of a property-owning economy, whereas this is one of the few pop albums to really sort of risk depressing the audience. And I know like the Smiths was and Joy Division were technically pop music too, but they're not pop music in a you know, not like this is pop music.
It's melodic dance music, whereas the Smiths like put themselves diametrically opposed to that. Sort of Joy Division did too until they became New Order.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, you know, the Smiths were.
This is pop in the way that New Order's pop.
Yeah, and New Order, the Smiths were explicitly marketing themselves as sort of an alternative anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
As arguably Joy Division too.
Yeah, whereas at the time this wasn't like, I don't know, Bananarama or maybe even like Gary Newman, but it was alternative pop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it was very sort of
and it was popular in the clubs. Yeah.
But certainly, like, and the previous album and this one, like, there is definitely.
Well, they're on like Top of the Pops.
Yeah. There's definitely an attempt at like an appreciation for mainstream music, especially in a compositional sense. But obviously, Sylvian's his priorities as a lyricist were far different than all the other people who were on Top of the Pops in a very sort of mainstream accessible sense. And speaking of Top of the Pops, and here's the you mentioned him before, so that was cool. The challenge was to not mention a certain critic, and I thought, is it cheating to mention the other critic? You brought him up first, so why not? Simon Reynolds. I watched a talk Simon Reynolds had with these two younger guys on their YouTube channel.
Mark Fisher.
I didn't say it. In late 2020, I've said those two words enough on this channel. You know,
no, sorry, go
after
on.
a while, it's just like I can't just keep falling into.
Yeah, no, well, especially with this song and album in particular. But you did a good job of avoiding it. For sure.
I appreciate that. Simon Reynolds is talking to these two younger guys and probably talking about the aforementioned fellow. At the end there, and then something about, you know, Ghost of My Life and the performance, and then the guys mentioned in passing, and Reynolds is briefly talking about it, and the guys mentioned in passing, hey, I never saw that. And Reynolds like immediately sort of interrupts him. Oh no, you got to see it. Blah blah blah. You know, just goes on about it. And I was, and then right after the interview finished, because we were watching it, and they're like, well, we got to watch it now, haven't we? Because we're on YouTube. This is 2022, and so I watched what must have been the most like few things have lived up to the hype more than that performance.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
Wow, that like the power of the song already, and then some. Like it's like it was like Sylvian had like a perfect control over what he wanted as like the sort of video companion to the track itself. I mean,
Sure.
an artist can't be happier with like a film accompaniment to their work. I mean, it's a lip sync performance, so it really is just a video accompaniment.
Yeah, in classic TOTP fashion. But...
Yeah, because I believe they were on Old Grey Whistle Test and they did a performance of that. But interestingly, it was a little bit different. And I think Ryuichi Sakamoto was the keyboardist.
Oh man, I gotta check that out. That sounds cool.
Yeah, I've only read about it. I don't know if it's. I assume it's available.
It should be on YouTube. Yeah.
Whistle Test. I don't think they were like wiping their tapes or anything.
No, there's plenty of whistle tests out there. Yeah.
Nice, and they did play live.
That was the Rocker show. Yeah. And Top of the Pops was the Poptimus show. They sort of made it that way because I think Whistle Test was around earlier and was more like a soft yacht rock sort of show.
Oh yeah.
But then around the time punk came, they decided to reformat it to make it like live, like authentic punk recordings and stuff like that. You know,
True.
Performances, the alternative music.
I got you. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's Japan Tin Drum. I think it's utterly phenomenal. Can't get enough of it. I guess for a while there, the reason it took me a while, I guess it seemed like the kind of album I'd want to pick on Mandala, but I felt like the albums I picked in the first ever Mandala sort of like, you know, they sort of got my point across in regard to like, you know, championing 80s albums, these amazing LP artifacts, and not just like, you know, throwaway venues so people can buy something else other than the two singles. I think get tricked into buying an album full of mostly filler.
Yeah.
But no, that is not the case of a lot of these really brilliant British acts. They were as artistically inclined, maybe even more so, more imaginative in their own way than the prog bands of the 70s. Because virtuosity is great, but these guys didn't have to rely on virtuosity. Their music was just as interesting, captivating, intellectually gripping, and perhaps most importantly, in the long run, a lot more re-listenable.
That's
You
probably
wanna
the
come
key
back
to
to
it.
it
They don't
so many
rely on
times.
virtuosity. Like they do have,
and it's tremendously virtuosic.
Yeah, they have elements of virtuosity, but they don't rely on it.
Not at
That's
all.
for sure. And that's a neat mixture of practice and experimentation, and sort of honing like pop sensibilities. This album does do that again, like in its populist sense. It does it very effectively. Like re-listening to it again, I was like, man, this. I wouldn't say this about many albums, but this is a certified hood classic.
Yes. If you haven't checked this one out, and if you're listening to Mandala for whatever reason, you're probably already some sort of music fan, so presumably you've heard this already. And even if you have, listen to it again, because, I mean, I want people to have as pleasurable lives as possible, and if your life is to be pleasurable, well, what couldn't hurt than to listen to Tin Drum? It can be existentially confronting, but I think they're very important questions to ask, and I believe in the dignity in preserving the dignity of others, and sometimes that means trying to encourage people to sort of remove themselves from, let's say, I'm not trying to sound condescending here, but denial. Now anyway, moving on toward this particular thing from New Zealand, yes?
Yeah. We've got the Wild Poppies and Pure Heroin. Speaking of, heroin is not fun, kids.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
It was another New Zealand artist who had the album name Pure Heroin. This one's called just Heroin.
Oh, that's right, yeah. No, this is Lord. I picked Lord.
Oh man, this is the wrong picture. Sorry everyone.
Yeah, whoopsie daisy.
Wrong album cover.
Well, we got the Wild
I listened to the
Poppies
wrong album.
and Pure Heroin. This as opposed to Lord is an actual New Zealand album. Or at the very least, like...
An actually good one.
Ooh, shots fired.
Well,
yeah.
everyone knows she's terrible. It's 2024.
Oh, no, I was just being silly. I agree. Unless, like I said, an actual New Zealand album. It's not just, like, taking off the pop sensibilities of, like, American, like, minimalist 2010s pop music, which is one of the worst genres, for sure.
Sometimes.
This one's more of, like, I don't know, it doesn't feel like a typical sort of, like it's a weird blend of, like, most of the Kiwi sort of jangle stuff is very, like, stripped back and lo-fi in a way, and maybe has some, like, keys or, like sort of swooning pop elements, whereas this album was more in the, like, still very jangly, but more, like, neo-psychedelic in the sense that there would just be, like those sort of 60s pastiche, like psychedelic guitar, like, licks and stuff like that, mixed with just like, clean acoustic jangling, but also just like electronic drums and stuff like that. And I don't know, I thought this one was a fairly unique album as far as like New Zealand jangle goes. It reminded me more of like two other bands I do like quite a lot, the Close Lobsters and the Stone Roses. I thought it was interesting that, like, for a Kiwi band, this sort of had more of that, like, North England, like, jangle vibe to it, But it's also right around the same time that a lot of those bands are just sort of starting to get big, and, New Zealand didn't really have express records back then. You couldn't get media that quickly, So it feels strange, like, this sort of is a permutation that happened in England and New Zealand simultaneously,
Yeah.
It's sort of an album that, like, I don't know, as a fan of the genre, had a sort of immediacy to me where I was like, this is a very unique take on how to do this sort of style, It's not typical. It's not, I could see to someone who's not a fan of, like, jangly, like, punk rock pop music, it just being a bit sort of, maybe even in a Beefheart sense, like, doesn't make sense, But as a sort of person who's heard way too much of the stuff that might even is just sort of mediocre, I was like, this is a really interesting take on all the tropes and how to arrange them into these sort of psychedelic collages for like rock pop music. Sort of surprised me, It has elements of this sort of 60s psychedelia pastiche, but it feels very, like, reinterpreted in a way that, say, someone like Mark Fisher would have criticized the Smiths or the Stone Roses for. I feel like this band sort of came to it from less of a pastiche degree, and it's done in more of just an experimental way, even. Like, trying to bring back those sounds, but not necessarily be, like, the biggest band in the world, like, the Stone Roses wanted to be or something. Or the Smiths even wanted to be, in a way,
Oh, yeah.
This is just sort of done out of the love of all those sort of elements of, like, 60s psychedelia and pop music, I feel. And I guess that's why it's sort of very immediate for me. The album itself is quite good, and then there's, like, all these other songs, like, similar to, I would have mentioned, the Snow Patrol's first album.
Yeah.
Which is, like, a collection of, I guess, the EPs or singles and stuff.
Mm.
And all those are really good as well, even different to the album itself. I assume they're all, like, done just in their own recording sessions. So the band sounds similar, but the album has a sort of murkiness to it, which some of the singles are a bit more clean, actually. Still in, like, a DIY sense, but, like, almost sounds more like, a more, just slightly more lo-fi version of, like, the first Blur album, where they're doing that baggy pastiche sort of thing.
Mm.
So yeah, I guess I was just sort of captivated that there was a New Zealand baggy album out there. Somehow. I guess they have a Grebo album and one baggy one too.
Did they, the songs on the sort of reissue, are they from the later EP, which it says here was called Out of Time from 89?
Yeah, it could have been. I'm not sure. I haven't looked it up. I just assumed they were from, other stuff.
Yeah, because they have a single as well from the same year. And that song, I'm pretty sure, isn't on the track list. No, it's not. The song Where Is Wellington, I don't remember hearing a song.
Oh, yeah, that's the first one that comes on after the album. Yeah.
So I guess on the original track listing here, it's not there. So that confirms my not having a memory of a song with that phrase in it.
Yeah, or if you... That's the song that most, like, abruptly sounds like the first Blur album. Even.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, I wouldn't think to describe this as baggy. Maybe upon closer inspection I would hear more indications of that, though.
Yeah. Less so the album itself. It's more, like, jangly, neo-psych sort of stuff, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Because, what's really interesting is that, I heard this, and I thought that it was one of the very better examples of the genre I heard. Like, I thought this was as good as anything I heard from the Triffids, and you mentioned Close Lobsters before, and I was going to mention them.
Yeah,
that's a really
for
great
sure.
album, because everyone heard Close Lobsters, which I hadn't heard before. You picked it for Mandala. I don't think I'd really heard of them, period. I was just like, hey, this is fantastic. This is some jangle I can really like. Because, I wasn't as hot on Go-Betweens, and even stuff that's, like, still pretty good, like Another Sunny Day and The Apartments, just to relegated to Mandala picks. I'm like, yeah, these are pretty good, but, like, they just don't do much for me in the long run. But, like, something like this is magnificent. And I'm very fond of the Triffids' work, for example. I'm very fond of the Chill's best work. Even the Bats' best work is very good, but I don't know part of, like, even the best maybe I need to explore the Bats a bit more, but like I've listened to what's it called, Highway.
Your Daddy's Highway.
Yeah, a couple times. And I do think it's very, very good. But there's on first listen, like I thought this was like a rich production. Really, just all the songs were catchy. Great vocals. To me, it was just like one of the greatest justifications of the genre I ever heard. Remember what I said about Suede last show, where it was like it goes beyond just being a Britpop or like a British guitar pop album. It's just this universal act of really beautiful music. Like Nick Jones is imbued with Englishness, but to the rest of the world, even though it'll sound English, it's just beautiful music. Whereas like even something like the Smiths and the other jangle bands, Field Mice or Another Sunny Day or whatever, that'll sound so subcultural to people around the world.
Sure.
Whereas like this would just sound like beautiful music.
Yeah, it's more in that sort of vein. I definitely agree. It sort of feels like it's more of a whole band piece, whereas something like The Apartments, Another Sunny Day, that's like a band attached to more like singer-songwriter sort of stuff. Whereas, this is definitely, it's weirdly like sort of orchestrated in just like a very musical way. That's true, yeah.
No, I thought it was magnificent. I was just, I was really like, I thought like the 3 New Zealand albums picked on Mandala, I thought these could be 3 of the better albums I've heard in general. Like these,
I was surprised that they just.
They're just so rich. Like all the things maybe because like Australia and New Zealand have a fairly similar sensibility in terms of like what we like.
They're essentially a state.
And when Australian bands are doing like an interesting underground thing that's like not trying to pander or be commercial, I adore it because we have similar sensibilities. Whether Severed Heads, Feed Time, Cybertron mentioned earlier, some of King Gizzard stuff. It really like gets to me because it's like. It feels like we're on a similar wavelength,
Yeah,
and it's
for
close
sure,
to me.
for sure.
It resonates with me. And it's the same thing with the New Zealand bands. Same thing with Australian and New Zealand
Well, that's
films.
sort of what attracted me to them in the first place. And through that, I ended up making friends with the Kiwi guy. So it's, like I said, I feel like New Zealand's almost like a quasi-state of Australia. Or really, we don't, like, pay enough attention to each other.
And the beautiful thing about a lot of those New Zealand artists is that unlike a lot of the Australian artists, there's a lot less temptation because New Zealand bands, they kind of figured that it's going to be quite difficult to get big, and so being big in New Zealand is sort of enough of an achievement to keep us going. And not a lot of Australian bands, and the kind of the crapper New Zealand bands apparently were the ones who tried to pander to Australia. Whereas the Australian bands,
that's like Dragon and stuff like that.
And then you got the Australian bands who they were trying to break the UK/America, and so a lot of those bands, that was a more feasible possibility than New Zealand breaking the world, and so a lot of Australian bands fell into that temptation, and they were pretty shit. But the underground bands that were just trying to appeal to like a club scene in Sydney or Melbourne or wherever the heck, Brisbane, they were some amazing bands out there. Take Australia's hardcore band Fungus Brains, or take we mentioned Severed Heads, but also SPK, world-renowned industrial act.
People
probably didn't sell a lot of records, but world-renowned industrial act. Very renowned.
Well, because they were kind of pioneers as well. Well, part of the pioneering generation, for sure. Similar to Severed Heads. Yeah. And I think one of them is a Kiwi as well. One or two of the members of SPK.
Oh, cool.
They're like a co-band even.
Yeah, nice. Or we take one of the very best electronic albums ever, and go check out her YouTube channel because she still uploads some interesting videos and musical accompaniments that she provides. Yantra de Wilder, and her album from the late 80s, Oceana, I think it's called Oceana, A Promise of Tomorrow, one of the most beautiful albums ever composed, and it was all on one particular synthesizer, every sound on the album. Someone uploaded it and she commented, "Oh hey, it's good to see this is out there." It was all composed on this.
So the anti-Severed Heads.
Yes, that story.
Tom.
Oh, Tom Allard. But no, yeah, I'm a huge champion of this. Like this is like as far as like makes me feel like I don't really have anything, when I don't care for a jangle band. It's not that I have anything against jangle, it's just that I see the potential in the genre a lot.
But I go saying, because I saw this as like an instant classic as well. Like I only first heard it like a week ago, and I'm already like, especially the song Walkabout, I'm like, this is sick. That's a good one. Most of the songs are really good though.
I mean, to be fair, like as far as like the jangle goes, I'm an enormous fan of the Smiths' music and REM's in the 80s. So, like, the biggest stuff.
And they're the two biggest ones, but they're two of the best ones as well, to be fair.
But I guess, not being a go-betweens fan and like other stuff here and there. It's just what it is, I suppose.
Man, I wish I would have gone. I saw footage of Robert Forster, the go-between songwriter who's still alive, because the other guy died in like the 2000s. And he was playing at just some pub like down the road. And the footage was actually really good. He sounded really good, and it's just him and a guitar, and so it doesn't age in the way that, like, I see things like Pavement just rub me the wrong way when I see it.
Oh, right, when they're performing.
Yeah, when they're performing live in 2024, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just him with a guitar, and I'm like, man, the songs are still, like, they still work in that way, you know? They're sort of timeless in that capacity, or at least they don't, you know, they don't age in certain ways, like,
Cool.
you know, it's sort of evergreen in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of what I appreciate about something like the Go-Betweens, whereas, like, or at least that element of the songwriting, whereas, like, this is a completely different thing. This is way more, like, musical in that sense, right?
Yeah, sounds it. Nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of something that's just purely, like, in a really, like, sort of totally abstracted and sort of,
Yeah.
you know, theoretical sense, music.
Yeah, like, almost, like, modest classicalism, you know,
I'm willing to assume that this Hans Joachim Rodelius release
from 2011.
from 1986, Weil das Wispern des Winds, like the whispering of the wind, is maybe the opposite of what one may have expected hearing the previous Mandala pick from Hans Joachim Rodelius, 1978's Durch die Wurst.
Yeah, it is a very different, yeah, for sure.
Because what he's decided to do is, rather than exploring electronic sort of ambient music soundscapes, he's gone for pure just classical piano-based ambient soundscapes.
Very minimalist classical, yeah.
What a fascinating...
And at certain points it felt like stretched out like Penguin Cafe orchestra pieces.
What a fascinating thing he's done here is kind of almost like rising up to maybe the challenge of more sort of old school music hierarchy in Europe, Western Europe at that time, who's like, oh, this electronic stuff, it's not real, you're not a real pianist, you're not a real musician. Joachim Rodelius rises to the challenge, and he decides to apply, like Harold Budd has on a few albums, especially with Eno, or Roger, you know, on especially on the recent Mixing Colours, which had a Mandala, was a Mandala pick earlier in the year. He's decided to incorporate a classical piano philosophy within the ethos of like sort of ambient and new age music, and rather than sort of, you know, being invested in a sort of classical virtuosity or you know, abilities within spontaneous improvisation, he's trying to play for in a psychological engine rather than like Eric Satie's concept of furniture music, which inspired Eno's ambient music.
Yeah, that's classic. Yeah.
I feel like he's approached it from this perspective. It's different from classical minimalism, I feel, which Harold Budd does kind of fall into that, really. It's more, I mean, maybe technically it is kind of classical minimalism, but it's sort of trying to invite the mental spaces evoked by Eno's work and Joachim Rodelius / Cluster's. Well,
I
Cluster's
just assume that's
influence
what
in the
classical
70s.
minimalism was trying to do anyway.
Well, you think about the work of like Philip Glass and Steve Reich, and they are trying to be like it's an ethos in regard to like big, large, sweeping compositions, where they just have a very different mind in regard to their procedure within the classical framework.
Yeah, those are a bit more like they have building crescendos.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, as opposed to this is more sparse and meant to, like, in the furniture music sense, fill the space.
We could say it's psychologically minimalist. It's not baroque, and like we think of a lot of Western European classical music as a sense of, you know, the grand and the big and, you know, this cultural epoch. Whereas like something like this, it's very, very small and very, very intimate by comparison.
Yeah.
And we got you know, Joachim Rodelius obviously worked with Eno in Cluster and Eno, and then of course on the very, very brilliant 1978 After the Heat, credited to Eno, Rodelius, and Mobius, the other member of Cluster. And but what he's tried to do specifically here is avoid all the electronics, but try to capture the same effect of a lot of those albums, like certainly mentally and like removed from the sort of appeal, maybe potentially in the eyes of some who deride it, sort of the more superficial sort of ear candy appeal of the electronics. He's tried to go pure for the psychological source, which is probably at the end of the day what he's more interested in with the electronics. Because if he was just interested in electronics period, then he might be trying to just compose just more maximal pieces. But even when he's working in electronic music, they're more careful, manicured and considered, which definitely suggests someone who's less interested in the tech itself, and more interested in the tech being able to do things and create sensations which maybe even the classical sort of framework is sort of dancing around too much. But now he's decided to try and sort of try to travel to that world via the classical, more classical sort of piano music based framework. And I think it's an extraordinarily beautiful composition, because normally, like, you know, just the idea of listening to solo piano music wouldn't necessarily appeal to me. Maybe because, you know, it would be, you know, I mean, jazz piano can be amazing, but it's usually been very, you know, when you're a genius composer / improviser, you know, you can listen to Solo Monk or Oscar Peterson or Bill Evans all day, you know.
Sure.
But
They
then-
have such a feel for the instrument. Yeah.
And like obviously, like if it's a very like specifically classical piece, you know, it can be thick or style, it can be very appealing and sort of exotic, especially, you know, given centuries removed from it. So if someone's playing several Brahms pieces or Chopin in a succession,
Sure.
it'd be gorgeous, of course.
Yeah.
Stravinsky, there's something that's closer to us, and that's still quite riveting. But
As a sort
I
of
think
post,
that requires more instruments, to be fair.
as a postmodern take on that sort of style of piano music, though, this is a very, very sort of like potent example, right? Like you mentioned, Harold Budd and Eno. Some of Eno's works, you know, are sort of similar, but this is right up there with that. Honestly, it's sort of it creates a serenity out of just space, you know. It's not too complex. Once again, it's just a sort of simple music. It's like music that doesn't ask much from you, you know. You just sort of, if you're willing to listen to it, you get as much out of it as you put in, you know.
Yeah, and it's important in a vaguely John Cage sense that few music recordings are the spaces without sound as important and as integral as those with, because it's sort of trying to complement what you're experiencing in the moment of listening to it with the notes themselves.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
It's important to think about. And like he's operating within because this sort of you compare this, like, you know, if someone was just playing a piano randomly, it can tend to fall into sort of dinner jazz cliches, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Just typical licks and stuff like that. Yeah. This sort of it's minimalist in the sense that it eschews all those licks to just go straight from, you know, I'm not theoretically inclined, but from like key to key or from scale to scale and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Just to make like sort of jaunting decisions, right?
Yeah, it's not the sort of like, if someone proposed to listen to an album of solo piano pieces, it's not the kind of music I would have expected to hear. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I couldn't imagine. I mean, it seems obvious after having heard it, but it doesn't strike me as something that a pianist would spend a whole album doing. And once they have, it's a revelation. Obviously, I wouldn't have listened to this, ironically, if I didn't think it was going to be some electronic soundscape based upon the artist and the cover. But it fulfills the very same similar function as I was trying to... Yeah.
And I listened to it with headphones as well, and there are those stabs of progressive electronic.
Sure.
In one side of the stereo,
Okay.
and in the other, and like is the more piano, and it was very interesting in that way too. It sort of, you know, in the way I'd even describe Psychic TV's binaural album as having like a sense of 3D space. This sort of did that within stereo.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. It was a good headphone listen.
Yeah, I've only listened to this externally, and yeah, that's amazing to hear that.
Yeah. And especially walking around at one point, even like cicadas started coming on, and I'm like, is this the music? And then the cicadas are really loud around me, because I had the music up pretty loud, and I'm like, oh wow, that just blended in so well to this.
See, that's the point, and then I think Rodelius would feel like that was sort of the function of the album.
Exactly, yeah.
Especially because at this time, cassettes and headphones, Walkmans, especially, you know, Germany was fairly West Germany was fairly technologically advanced. It wasn't out of the ordinary for Rodelius to imagine, you know, this being listened to in such a portable context, because I remember I've seen media in like the early 80s, and like you see like fictional media, TV shows and films where like there's like older people listening to like portable music devices and like old symphonies, and so like older people were loving the idea of being able to listen to classical symphonies sort of on the go outside in their own private world, you know, those very sort of primitive sort of headphones and
the early Walkmans,
those very early sort of cassettes, 8-track players, you know. So yeah, like I think this is a sort of album where Rodelius would have been imagined this not just exclusively listened to in like someone's home, you know what I mean, as like a vinyl, you know. He could have imagined this as being played in a cassette. If this had a cassette release, I'm not sure.
But
it didn't, but
No,
Okay,
but
so that defeats my purpose.
But this type of music, no, it doesn't, because plenty of them, the DIY artists, a lot of them just put out cassettes. Like, I remember I'd upload heaps of, like, ambient 80s and, like, progressive electronic and tribal ambient or atmospheric ambient that do field recording sort of stuff. There's heaps of it out there, all these, like, unknown artists, because it was very DIY.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is cassette-based. And I
Oh,
couldn't...
yeah. Oh, Yantra Dividals, so that's just a cassette, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, yeah, nice. There's heaps of it, yeah. It's a whole genre.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, and I assume it's for a similar purpose, for like sort of walks and journeys and whatnot, right? Like, you know, you sort of, it's very experiential. You sort of engage with the environment, with the music, in that sense, right? Whether it be in the furniture sense, like you're listening to it in a living room, or even outside, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this one, just being in an album, was more designed for the interior, but it still worked in the exterior for sure.
And plus, like, people forget, like, people have a different, because music could only be played via physical material means at that time, it was much more a concept that, like, you would just, there were vinyl records at every place, and the record player, turntable was at every place. You'd take your records to places, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it was your phone that you were going to plug into someone's, you know, Bluetooth or aux. So, you know, you could have taken this record to, like, your yoga class or whatever, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So,
Sure.
like, it could very well have functioned, like, you know, records were vaguely portable in that sense, you know what I mean? Yeah,
Yeah.
be it to a turntable, but still, like, there were, like, literally everyone had a turntable. It's like how everyone, it's like the idea of ever having a computer or a means to play music now. Everyone had a
Television.
turntable.
Yeah. For sure.
It was common as television.
Yeah. Every house had it.
Maybe more common at one point.
It would have been more common in the 50s for sure in Australia. Maybe even in the 60s, up until the end of the 60s. But yeah. I don't think nearly every Australian owned a TV until probably even well into the 70s.
Yeah.
So at that time, yeah, a record player was pretty much in every household, but not a TV necessarily.
Right.
So that is true, yeah. But yeah, no, I was quite, I was fairly taken with this album, especially as a piece of this sort of style of music, which is a style that, like, it's sort of like anti-populist in a way, but it's for, like, music people, but also not just music people who, like, you know, are inclined to sort of more, like I don't know, for lack of a better word, like deep experiential sort of parts of one's life, you know?
Yeah.
For people that don't want to just exist with the blinders on throughout their whole lives and just listen to dated references like Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera, if you know what I mean.
I think this does have a more vaguely populist appeal in the sense that there's lots of, you know, 24-hour live streams or like 8-hour videos on YouTube where it's just like quiet piano music for like study whatever.
Yeah.
And in that respect, that music, there's lots of hits, you know.
Those stuff are okay, but they're more wallpaper, whereas this is a bit more musically serious.
I guess so, but maybe some of these people who are interested in that would be taken by something more musically serious
I think
just
it's
because of the density of the music itself.
I agree. I think it's stuff like this.
How much more intrinsically compelling it is.
Should be championed more than like content bait, like that sort of stuff.
Of course,
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Like when I said it's not terrible, it's just because it's not terrible. You know, in theory, the actual thing itself, content bait, is kind of terrible, but the music itself isn't.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I agree. I wish people would, rather than just looking up like meditation mix YouTube, would look up an album like this or tons of them out there.
Let's hope the upload of this gets kicked off in the algorithm and becomes like one of the next big, you know, like Hiroshi Yoshimura's albums have been. For example,
those are effective.
Akira Ito, or I think he's more like, his early stuff was more like sort of acid house, but you know, Susumu Yokota, so his more 21st century works a lot more ambient and gets lots of hits on YouTube. You know Susumu Yokota.
I know.
Acid Mount Fuji.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we've heard some of those ambient albums a few times.
Yeah, I've heard one of the ambient ones. I can't remember what it's called. It's got like a woman on the cover.
Yeah, I actually don't remember what they're called either, but I know what they
but-
are based on their artwork.
And the
What my memories
man,
are.
I was listening. Because I always mix Japanese names up. But yeah, I was listening to that album again recently, and it's so good.
Acid Mount Fuji.
Yeah.
It's a must. It's one of the verifiable classics of the 90s.
It has cicadas in house music. What's not to go wrong?
I agree. Yeah, it's like, you know, like a lot of the best music of the 90s featured similar ideas, like say EMT records.
Sure, yeah.
That's all that was some of the most interesting music of that entire decade. Like people talk about all that alt rock or like sort of singer songwriter stuff. To me, like that's stuff, that electronic stuff's the most interesting music of the 90s.
Yeah, I agree. It's great. Yeah, most alt rock is kind of just shit. A lot of the 90s electronic is shit as well, especially as far as both of them are concerned. It's the mainstream stuff in my mind. They're both just kind of,
point, yeah.
like, because there's plenty of good still guitar based music in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
Same as there is in the 20s and the 20s, the 2000s, the 20s and the 2010s. But yeah, the mainstream music in the 90s was pretty shit.
Yeah.
There was every decade in a way.
People talk about how bad the 80s mainstream was. I find the 90s mainstream probably a bit more intolerable.
Yeah,
even more so than the 2000s mainstream.
I like mainstream 80s R&B more than 90s.
Oh, yeah.
So if that says anything.
There's some good stuff in the 90s here and there, and I do like Euro trash dance, I'm not gonna lie.
To some degree, yeah. But not overall. It's not like a love of mine, but as a sort of fun party thing, I do enjoy.
I'm one of these people who thinks Better Off Alone is one of the greatest compositions of all time.
I wouldn't quite go that far, but the melody is timeless. Yeah. The house elements of it are a bit just... But you're not meant to think that much about that song. That's the point, though. That's why it's so good.
It's so beautiful.
Similar to Missing by Everything But The Girl. Like, that sort of music you're not meant to think about, you know.
Like the deserts miss the rain.
Yeah, you're not meant to think about that. You're just meant to let the... It's a, just an atmospheric party sort of thing, right?
How about Another Night?
Yeah, that's another
that
one,
song.
but a bit too German, but that's kind of why I like it.
And it's very similar to an Acid House song I discovered years later called Electric Dance by Jungle Crew, which is a gorgeous song. And then I realized one day, I was like, oh, this is Another Night, like Another Night. But it's also It's My Life by Talk Talk.
There's a keyboard progression I heard in a live video of that, which sounded very similar. Yeah,
It's My Life by Talk Talk. So that's a beautiful song.
That is a really good song. That's one of those cliche 80s pop hits that is really good, or at least does live up to that hype, because it's adjacent to like Duran Duran and all that sort of stuff. But it actually is like transcendent in a literal way.
One of the best songs of that decade, I would say, is Rock Me Amadeus by Falco.
In a more playful way, I agree. Yeah. As a sort of less serious, just party jam, that song's really good. The weird, like almost like Yellow-esque electronic production's really good. Yeah. For sure.
Anyway, let's go a decade earlier. Some jazz.
Oh man, yeah. This my last pick. Mal Waldron with the Steve Lacy Quintet, self-titled album, I suppose. I first got into this one because remember when I had that I've mentioned a few times on the show, the old channel or whatever. I'd uploaded it, and there was just something really compelling about the cover. It's just this guy staring at you, and I was like, man, avant-garde jazz. Yeah, this will probably be good. And then I listened to it like a bunch of times a while ago because I just thought there's just something like maddening about it. And then recently I realized that I hadn't re-uploaded it, so I was like, I'll re-upload it and listen to it again. And yeah, it sort of lived up to the first few times I heard it because or at least I was uploading a lot of avant-garde jazz albums, and they do tend to blend a bit, though they are very out there and stuff like that. But this one, there's just something about it where I think the reason I kept coming back to it is because it felt like a sort of like a psychedelic bop experiment or something. Like, it was very unique in that sense where, around I think it's 72, a lot of this sort of like avant-garde and spiritual jazz goes into, it goes away from bop into more like tribal territories and stuff like that. Whereas I felt this group, or at least this album, keeps that sort of tradition but mixes it with the sort of psychedelic tendencies of late 60s music and contemporary influences. And then also has the Steve Lacy Quintet, who I also uploaded a bunch of Steve Lacy albums. And there's something about his use of horns. It's sort of Canterbury-esque in a sense, but almost even deeper than that. There's sort of warped, weird harmonies between two horns and stuff like that. And he does, similar to Lowell Coxhill, he does a lot of solo stuff with the horns, which is really compelling because it just, you have to create music out of just these noises, right? And so the way that blends in with I guess Mal Waldron is the pianist.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, he has the other thing I didn't realize until actually recently re-uploading the album was how I just looked up Mal Waldron and Steve Lacy, having listened to their music, I didn't realize how important they were to like the history of jazz.
Yeah, they're very prolific.
Because I'm not that well known in the jazz canon. I'm a bit more familiar with like the music, if you know what I mean, rather than the narrative. And it's mostly just obscure stuff by nature of the aggregate website, you know, having stuff that's not preferred, right? Less rated or whatever. Not being, you know, uploaded to YouTube. So typically the stuff I would have heard is, it'll often, if it's ever one of these jazz like canon guys, it's like their adjacent, just like cheap sort of album or something like that, you know, done out of a sort of like less commercial sort of sense or experimental. And I don't know, this album just goes in so many of those crazy directions, whether it be, like a psychedelic bop or just all these like, I can't explain the sort of, the language of jazz. I did notice the other day as well, this year someone wrote like a review on RYM for this album that is actually like, he knows the, you know, theory of jazz and what this album does in the theoretical sense or whatever, and has a very eloquent way of explaining it. I was like, oh wow, because I just enjoy it for, you know, more sonic reasons or whatever. Whereas he can hear from the album, like what hand Mal Waldron's using, like that sort of thing, you know? I find that very fascinating. It sort of crosses cultural barriers in that sense between people who know what the jazz is and people who just like the sound, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was, when I re-uploaded it, I was just like, will this be as good as I remembered? And it fucking was. I was like, man, I really enjoyed it. I don't know, just for someone who really does like the more out there like jazz experiments. I don't know, I've never really found them like indulgent or anything like that. I just kind of like them, yeah, as like endeavors of like almost like anti-commercial music, even like, you know, just music for trying to create things out of the ether, you know, not trying to appeal to anything, you know.
Right. Well, jazz was not at all like a commercially viable genre in the 70s, so a lot of these guys had no choice but to just do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe in sort of the more countercultural sort of spiritual era, like maybe that was somewhat more appealing. Maybe like there was a sense that you know, plus like the sort of snooty jazz club guys, like they'd turn those up a lot of stuff, whereas like, you know, like playing this more spiritual music, there's a spiritual buzz in America at that time, and you know, people were interested in seeing like sort of, you know, artists who were evoking a sort of world or like, you know, transhumanist sort of sensation. Anyway, so I wasn't familiar with this album. I wasn't even that familiar with Mal Waldron and Steve Lacy having collaborations. I'm familiar with Mal Waldron to an extent, but not to the same extent as I am certain other of the canonized or more canonized. Mal Waldron is very canonized.
Sure. I didn't realize how canonized he was.
Well, very much so, yeah. In the bop sort of continuum.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I can't say off the top of my head any Mal Waldron solo albums I'm familiar with. Though in a way, I'm less familiar with the grand scheme of like Steve Lacy's recorded output. Heaps, yeah. But what I am familiar with is, because I was a big fan of Don Cherry, and I was listening to a lot of Don Cherry albums at one point in my life.
Oh, Don Cherry.
He's brilliant. I became very fond of one of Steve Lacy's early albums called Evidence, which is packaged now as Evidence with Don Cherry.
Okay.
But I believe that was...
I think I actually have heard that one, yeah.
That's added a bit later.
And it was with Don Cherry.
But,
funnily enough, remember OK Tamiz?
Yeah, sure.
They just put out an album of like lost recordings that he did with Don Cherry in Istanbul.
Cool.
With what's the guy? You know, the African American author from the 60s or whatever.
Oh, Baldwin?
Yeah, with James
No, I did
Baldwin.
see this somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote like a play or something, and that was like the lost recordings that were meant to accompany it. It was okay, but I was like, wow, that's so weird.
Yeah, no, but that's how, because yeah, like when you mentioned that, I was like, oh yeah, James Baldwin. Yeah, I did see this somewhere.
Yeah,
I saw something like that. Yeah. But yeah, so I was a big fan of like Evidence, the Steve Lacy record, Don Cherry. I had it in my iTunes at one time, and I thought it was pretty killer. And I just knew Steve Lacy is just like great saxophonist. Well, not always. What's he again?
I'm pretty sure he plays the sax. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to hold on. Soprano sax. Yeah. Specifically that actually. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a bunch of sax.
But yeah. So I was a fan of that, and Mal Waldron, I don't think I was familiar with anything that he was the band lead. Like I may have heard a few things, but I don't have any memory of having a big impression on me if I did hear them, but I know of him as, like, when I look at his albums as a sideman, there's a number of albums here that I was quite fond of. He played on a number of albums of the great and seemingly a bit underrated Gene Ammons. Like, I'd heard some of his albums. Some people would call him underrated. I'd see him on YouTube, and like, these are terrific. Like, I guess he is underrated if I haven't heard of him until now. And he also plays with John Coltrane on Dakar, which is an awesome album, but not on every track on that album, if I'm not mistaken. No, every track. That's cool. I think there's another one with the album which is just called Coltrane, which was released in '57. Mal Waldron's on the piano on side 2, and the first side has consisted of sessions, which, as many were, of Coltrane in the late '50s, recorded with Red Garland, as they were both in Miles Davis's band at that time. Mal Waldron also, interestingly enough, played on a couple of records with the German sort of fusion world music act Embryo.
Oh,
including
nice.
on Rock Session, which I didn't know until looking at this.
Yeah,
actually.
cool. He
I
played with
love
Embryo.
and some of Embryo's albums is among my favourites, actually.
That's it.
And also playing with some of Mingus's albums.
Nice.
And Max Roach on percussion, Bittersweet,
Nice.
It's Time, and Speak Brother Speak. Maybe not on every track on some of those. But yeah, so point is, I was an admirer of a number of albums that Mal Waldron was at least a sideman on.
Yeah.
And
Very prolific sideman, seemingly.
yeah, oh, that's not half of what I mentioned.
Yeah.
That's,
I
you
couldn't
know,
imagine.
so,
Yeah.
you know, like what I mentioned is barely a quarter of it. The artists he played with. And Lacey's are quite extensive as well.
Yeah.
And the ones I wanted to mention, which are notable here, actually, because you know, sometimes like if Waldron, even if you're not familiar with their discography, I've heard them as a sideman, whether I realised it or not.
Yeah.
On other records.
That's heaps of jazz, Yeah.
Yeah, like Steve Lacy's has credits on, among other things, a couple of Cecil Taylor releases.
Oh, Cecil Taylor, yeah, he's good as well.
Yeah, he only passed away in like the last few years as well.
Yeah.
I remember hearing it was a news story. Not really, a friend told me. He played in a couple of Gil Evans releases. Miles Davis's Quiet Nights, 1963, that's one of the Gil Evans ones, and that's a really beautiful album. And he's one of the few people on there, but the only soprano saxophone player on there. This is around the time Coltrane's not in the group anymore. So, but to be fair, I mean, Coltrane was sort of Coltrane's understanding of the soprano sax was a bit interesting. It's actually a bit slippery, which lent itself to how interesting his compositions were on it, because it's not as traditionally professional.
Yeah,
Coltrane's
sure.
take on the soprano sax compared to someone like Lacey's.
Sure.
So I just sort of mentioned that because I know there are some jazz people who would jump on that, like the idea of like Coltrane being a soprano sax player. It's like, no, I've read the Spiels, I get it. But also
Lacey goes into in the more free jazz ones, like weird places, similar to like what Sanders does with that teapot thing.
On the other credit I wanted to mention from Lacey, which I wasn't aware of, speaking of Embryo, Steve Lacey played with Italian fusion prog act Area.
Oh, I don't know if I've heard them. Are they good?
Oh, Area are amazing, dude. They got so much cred.
Nice.
Area kick ass.
Maybe I recognize.
Everyone ought to be aware of Area.
Is it like one of the prog line or one of those sort of channel uploads? Maybe I've seen that.
No, because they would have official uploads.
Oh, okay, cool.
It's just quickly. I don't know if you've seen this cover around. This is their first one.
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah.
It's a kick-ass release.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I've seen that on like lists. Yeah.
No, they have quite a few albums. A bit less than I thought. Sorry, 73 to 80.
No, that's a genius cover as well. When I saw that, I was like, I'm gonna listen to this one day. Yeah, for sure. I'll have to check that out, especially if Steve Lacey's on it. Fuck.
It's not on. He's not on that one.
Oh, okay. But
he's on the 76 album.
Okay, but he played with them at some point. Okay.
And the on Maladati in 76 and Event 76, which is a live album. Anyway, onto the actual album itself, Mal Waldron and Steve Lacey.
I forgot you hadn't even talked about the album yet.
Yeah, I want to give backstory as to like who these guys were.
For sure,
how familiar I was with them.
Well, I'm not a Canon guy, so that was a good call.
And you know, just so listeners, because sometimes it's easy to just talk about, you know, for me to say this album's good, but like, you know, kind of put the players in a context for people who, you know, might not be aware. because the history of jazz is really lost on like in like the sort of 60s. The focus on recorded music history tends to be very like sort of 60s sort of Beatles onward. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of attention on jazz. Maybe on like Miles Davis and John Coltrane and a couple other people, but no one really knows much about the rest of it seemingly.
Yeah.
Maybe Mingus and Monk as well. And there's definitely so. All those people are extraordinarily brilliant.
Mingus is pretty popular on like RYM.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like
Yeah.
Mingus and Monk, yeah.
Yeah, and Monk too. Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, this is a very, very good album, and it fits into that very sort of lush, spiritual, sort of a bit weird, sort of 70s world. It's not as out there as some other stuff from around that time, so it's an interesting sort of world. It probably even didn't see itself as being, maybe didn't even see itself as being out there so much as just fulfilling where jazz was going in a vaguely, I mean, it's listed as free jazz here, which is fair enough, but
Yeah, it's not really free jazz though, is it?
well, but the thing is, it's that we think of free jazz as like being frenetic. It's sort of very sort of almost challenging at times. But I found this very maybe more post bop in the sense that post bop had the bebop structure, but it wanted to incorporate a lot of other sonic priorities in there, whether they're from soul, whether it was from maybe African traditional tribal
That's why I
music.
thought it was kind of like a psychedelic bop. Yeah.
Yeah, that maybe that's more what we can place this album into. It's very rich, very listenable. Maybe it's not even far removed, not quite as oriental, but like take, Yusuf Lateef's music, very spiritual, very worldly, but not free jazz by any means.
No,
I don't
yeah,
think anyone
yeah.
would claim that. But maybe we could put Yusuf Lateef in the post pop category,
Yeah, he's a bit post bop. He's probably got a bunch of post bop.
Yeah, I think the poster child of post pop is someone like Cannonball Adderley, and he got very spiritual and weird at times, but not like too alienating in the 70s, like very like Pan-African stuff.
Yeah.
But super cool music.
For sure,
He's
for
one of my
sure.
favorites actually. Like,
Yeah.
I'd call him.
He's one of the early like Pan-African guys as well. Like to get that big,
I think so. Yeah.
There are a few of them that, especially like South African ones, who would go to America, but like none that were as big as Cannonball doing it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I don't know if you can count Sun Ra in that category. I mean, he was never that big a figure by any means.
Nah, and he's
More
less
folk
Pan-African and
artist.
more of that like Afrofuturist. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, because he, I was almost going to suggest that someone like Cannonball is underrated, but in the jazz context, like, he's far from underrated. He's
Sure.
like, very canonized, but people outside of jazz have no idea who that is.
They don't know
Maybe
who
they
it
know
is.
of him as being one of the players on Miles's albums in the late 50s.
Yeah.
And that's the extent of it. But,
One time I was outside walking around at work, listening to the album by Cannonball that has Marabi on it. I forget what it's called.
oh, yeah. It's the late 60s. It's got the Rio Jesus is on the cover.
Yeah, with the cool cover. Oh,
Yeah.
it's nuts, like him in like a desert or something with a trumpet.
Yeah, well, Marabi's his composition, yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to that album once, and just outside walking around, and literally 4 people came up to me to tell me it was like amazing music. I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, this is amazing music for sure.
Yeah, like really.
So people who probably aren't even into jazz, who just heard the music and was like, this is
I think
amazing.
that was a fairly big song. It definitely became a jazz standard, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's a standard, but it was just the album, it wasn't necessarily that song.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
I misheard. Yeah, very good stuff here. I almost want to bring up, I'm trying to like look through Cannonball Adderley and find out what's what. It's not loading for me, so I'll just have to just give that up and move on. Damn the internet.
Yeah.
It's really annoying sometimes. I don't even. But anyway, I guess I'm just going to go on to my last pick now.
Yeah.
So we can talk about rock music. We can talk about
I thought this was a jazz
rockism. This one we're talking
The
about. now.
Pretenders, yeah.
Well, I mean,
Self-titled
They-
jazz.
they care about their precise musicianship, but it's in a different context from jazz, I suppose.
No, that's true. It is fairly precise.
Yeah. No, what we've got here is this album's interesting in that it can fall into like a sort of that world of rockist appreciation, but it's also an album that everyone from like the punk and new wave world that was trying to burn rockism to the ground thinks is a major classic.
Similar to Elvis Costello at the time. They were like,
Yeah.
this is our one, in that sense. But a bit cooler than Elvis Costello
Way
still.
cooler, in my
Yeah,
opinion,
well,
yeah.
as far as the music goes, I agree. But even that's how they viewed it.
Oh,
back
sure,
then,
sure, yeah, I got you. Yeah, what we have with the Pretenders, I first heard this album when I was like 17, and like I thought there were weird touches where it sounded not too dissimilar for the kind of music that you could hear on like WSFM or something like that.
Well, they would play it on there.
Well,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
very true. But it was also like very.
It's got like those Fleetwood Mac elements, you know.
It was also very serious and catchy, and like all the instrumental touches from the band were really precise and fascinating as someone who was into like getting into like prog and post punk around that time. And so I just found this group. I just kind of got I downloaded it because it's an acclaimed album and it was one of several. And even though like there were maybe other albums of this ilk that weren't appealing to me as much, maybe like Elvis Costello or some other new wave acts. Like this is around the time where I first tried to get into Talking Heads, and it was a bit annoying for me.
Yeah, Talking Heads can be a bit like that.
And also the fan base around, there's kind of smug sort
Yeah.
of like fan base around like Talking Heads references online really shit me.
It
at the
took
time.
me like fucking 10 years to get into Talking Heads because
Oh, yeah.
my mum used to like it when I was a kid.
Oh,
so
sure.
it sort of put me up in that sense.
get you,
But then eventually I heard the music and you hear it stoned
Yeah.
and tripping. You're like, oh, the music's good. You know?
Yeah, I was a big fan of Psycho Killer. That all being said,
No, it's a pretty good song. It's not
even
that
when
great, it's good.
even when I was sort of off put by the band a little bit. But anyway, but Pretenders, I was just like, there's something about the album that was so compelling, and just like every moment where it had the opportunity to sort of like demonstrate that it was a great sort of re-listenable release, it would sort of go there. There was no like in a sort of like critical sense where you're sort of listening to it, and this is where it's rockist in a way, listening to it, looking for like things to sort of cite as a flaw, in the sense that you're like checking for it like it's Sgt. Pepper's or Dark Side or Zeppelin 4 or something. It really fulfilled that criteria. But then also, in terms of just like really listenable, catchy, sort of just bass, sort of, want to click play again music, it fulfilled that as well. It was so strange like that. And then there's very few things that seem to fall into this category that either like full on like alternative sort of just like this would never be played on the radio, even if it's like sort of bit more polished, maybe on Triple J or something like that, but like and then it's sort of like more like a sort of like big ugly wall of sound sort of just structured music. It's one of the few records which is so seamlessly both of those things.
Yes and no, because things like Susie, let's say, and the Banshees, which is very similar to this album, especially a bit after this album maybe, even they sort of went in a bit of the direction, they were able to still keep that weird alternative thing, if you know what I mean.
But they were never that mainstream.
In England.
I'm thinking more in an Australian context. Because I'm thinking of
They
this in
were
the
big,
context of
but-
WSFM, you understand, rather than Triple J.
Yeah. Or even like they'll play Susie songs on Triple M.
Really?
Yeah, maybe even WSFM at this point. You might hear, Cities of Dust or whatever.
The Susie song.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit of that, but like they were fairly big, believe it or not. But I do agree. Like this does is one of the rare things that occupies both worlds of that sort of rockism, I suppose, or like traditionalism. It tries to do a bit of the similar to Costello, like coming off like Buddy Holly or Roy Orbison, old rock and roll sort of pop tropes and things like that, but then bringing it in with that new wave like cold guitar, little like staccato like XDC elements and things like that, right?
Yeah.
A bit of first wave punk rock, like a bit of the Jam and the Clash, but done in a more new wave recording sort of sense,
Yeah.
with a lot of focus on Chrissy Hines vocal performance as well. Like maybe even like Janis Joplin sort of way, like trying to put her really forefront in the production,
Yeah, yeah.
Even though the band is extremely like interesting. Sorry, do you want to finish your preliminary thoughts?
Oh well, another thing I was going to say was it's also partly rockist in a sense that it seems like an extremely hi-fi production for the time and for a debut group.
Yeah, the production's very good for sure.
It's one of these things where like the record is like it's funny, how like when albums will come out now, say Why doing that album in the 2000s, or even there are accusations around like Squid and earlier in this decade where people are going, oh, I think this is just a repeat of the past, I don't know, I think this is just blah blah blah.
Yeah.
You can find contemporary reviews where certain magazines are like, this isn't as new as the other magazines are claiming. This is traditionalist, blah blah blah. And it's like now we look at it as a distinct part of a movement, you know what I mean? And like the people who like to champion nothing new ever has happened in music in the last however many years, like now they'll always jump to like punk being an example of slash new wave as see, that's an example of when something new happened. But maybe some people at the time were questioning about how much of that was actually new in the first place.
Well, plenty.
I
Partridge again.
I'm of a mind where if it feels new, I think that's kind of enough.
Yeah.
Because if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of it, like you have people going, "Oh, Star Wars isn't that new. Oh, Jurassic Park's not that new.
Yeah.
Oh, hip hop's not that new," and it's just like, all right, we can do this all day
Yeah.
if we really want to. Christianity wasn't that new. You know, like everything
Sure.
ever, even the oldest things.
The stars aren't that new.
They're not. But no, what we had here was this, I think, is honestly one of the finest documents of rock music of all time. Like, it's very like traditional in its context for 1980, but it was also very sort of forward thinking and sort of pushing rock music into grounded in the roots of the genre, like as in the rock and roll itself, not like the roots of rock and roll, I mean, but like it wants to sort of push it forward a little bit compositionally, like in terms of it's championing the idea, like glam rock did in the early 70s, that there was a lot more to be said within these songwriting paradigms.
Yeah.
And like
Sure.
and with such a tight, beautiful free piece, I mean, they proved it more than anyone else in or more than most other recorded acts in the history of rock. I mean, these three guys, James Honeyman Scott on guitar, and Pete Farndon on bass, Martin Chambers on drums. This is like the coolest like new wave like rock instrumentalist like composers of all time. These guys are so precise, they're so creative, and a bit like it's weird. I might as well compare this to Hans Joachim Rodriguez. Like what they don't play, when the fact that the notes that they choose to withhold are very much just as important, because they can finish. James Honeyman Scott can finish a guitar solo that is like barely a fraction of the length of, say, like Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, or Eddie Van Halen. But what he's done there is he's forced you to kind of focus on that little melody, the series of notes, riffs, licks he's put together there, and that little emotional statement. Like, you know, you focus on that, and he felt that was the emotional sort of reaction. That was the musical reaction of sort of the emotion that the piece required. You know what I mean? It's not about the soloing and the technicality itself, and it's very proficient, obviously, but it's more to do with.
Well, it's more creative.
Yeah, it's more to do with just. That's kind of why I like though that the 80s era of the chime guitarist a bit more so, and he's sort of, and this James Honeyman Scott's seemingly like the big godfather of all those guys, according to those guys.
Yeah, he's an early one for sure.
Those little solos were packed with so much more energy and feeling, because that was the point of them, not to show off the instrumental prowess of the guitarist.
No, well, you can hear the influence on Johnny Marr, for example. Like, even just the first little riff of, like, This Charming Man. It packs so much emotion into one little, like, phrase, right? Which is definitely what this guy's doing.
Yeah, and the fact that he does pack feeling into, like, a smaller, by comparison, you know, electric guitar solo, it is, like, default sort of intrinsic proof of his ability as a musician. Inherently. And so, and then now I want to move on to talk about Chrissy's presence on the album a little bit. Why this is partly a definitive rock statement is because, I mean, it's one of these albums where, like, it's not like Chrissy's doing this whole gimmick of, like a bit with the Runaways was the case, and Joan Jett, hey, I'm a girl doing this.
Nah, she's not.
It's just a
at
rock
all.
front man. It's just a front person.
Or just an artist.
Yeah, and while it's her femininity, it's imbued with her being a woman, a certain feminine disposition. It's not
a little bit. Yeah,
it's not remotely gimmicky.
The emotions are real. Like, it's in the head of like a woman's emotions that you can empathize with. It feels, because it feels real. It doesn't feel like artifice, you know.
And that's why I would call this a definitive rock document, is because it actually, and this so few of them did, because it's such a male-oriented genre, seemingly for the most part, is...
Sure.
And even though it was a very, very popular genre, girls are buying it just as readily for a while.
Yeah.
And it really, sort of, including Chrissy herself at one time, obviously, when she was younger.
My mum liked rock music.
Yeah, you know, like, it actually documents the cross-gender seamlessness of rock music in a way that a lot of the other albums didn't do, because I think like the Runaways were just obsessed with the sort of gimmick of you're the girl group, you're the girl rock band.
Yeah, and just not good musicians or creative in the same way, you know.
And Blondie, there was always like sort of like a sort of cutesy, sexy aspect to Blondie, I feel vaguely, whereas like Chrissy's not really that sexualized. She's just sort of there.
Yeah.
She's just sort of like the tough rock front person, as I said, you know.
Yeah.
There's and just very bold and sort of like callous, amoral, lyrical persona she presents on here. Like, I mean, you know, she's, you know, seemingly potentially chiding aspects of other people because she sees them in herself on songs like Precious. Brass in Pocket is famously about her like realizing she has to channel genuine, and seemingly all other pop stars do, because she's probably accused them of this in her head before, of a certain narcissism. She has to channel this sort of idea that she's special and like, you know, this unique sort of deserves to be on stage and them not, even though she's trying to like resonate with them. There is sort of a catch-22 there.
The larger than life rock star thing, for sure.
It's one of the...
That's true. I never thought about that, but that song does make sense in that sense. It's like a sort of snowflake anthem.
And then how about like the brutally edgy, I think it was even fairly quite controversial then, Tattooed Love Boys, which Chrissy has written about an experience where she was, I believe as she tells it, raped by several bikers after like gets mouthing off of them. There's some botched drug deal or something.
Jesus.
And then she's written the song with lyrics like, you know, stop your simmering, you're gonna make some plastic surgeon a rich man, you know. I shot my mouth off and they told me what that hole was for. They showed me what that hole was for. It's just like really shocking lyrics, and it's just it's hard to fathom that someone would actually write that about what they experienced. But I think she's...
Well, the punk world would.
I guess so. It's like she's trying to like...
And she worked with McLaren at that shop. You know, she was really ingrained in that world. I didn't know that. That's pretty...
Such an interesting phenomenon, like trying to like, you know, look at the experiences as sort of like, you know, chaotic, horrible, like life is a jungle event, and singing about it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But like, you know, having actually experienced it, you know, horrifyingly, like she's the one who can actually, the only one who could speak about it in such a way, you know. Because, you know, to the perpetrators of the act, they see it as like some sort of demonstration of their power, but like, so that they can't see it as anything other than like some sort of, you know, them trying to prove something, but or get some retribution. But like, there's a sort of wicked man there. But you know, Chrissy, who was the apparent victim of the event, has that then opportunity, and it's very bizarre that someone would take this. Not wrong, but very unusual at least. But creatively fascinating, frankly. I have to admit that she would just, because it's just I can't imagine being in that situation and then choosing to come out of it and write like this sort of using it to write a piece about this, told from the perspective of like a sort of this amoral narrator, using the sort of violent energy and the sort of horror and anarchy of the events to sort of punctuate like an upbeat sort of aggressive sort of sort of reorienting sort of psychologically driven instrumentally new wave song. Like it's just like this is why I think art critics were like more inclined on these sort of like new wave and punk songs rather than sort of the longer, more virtuosic prog acts. Because this is like a more serious and more like complicated artistic statement than most of things in prog rock.
It is a bit more,
period. Like it's a very, very like daring and sort of like it crosses mediums in terms of like it being an interesting act of human expression.
And I agree, it means something for sure. Whereas I don't know, so prog does. I do enjoy some prog, but it does.
A lot of it.
Yeah, especially by the late 70s though, when the critics are really deriding it. I suppose it does go into like erecting castles in the sky sort of territory, right?
Yeah, going for the one on Tomato, and then the work stuff was just beyond redemption, in my opinion.
Yeah, so it just becomes a point where
For the
the
most part,
music
it
has
is,
lost a
yeah.
bit of like cultural meaning, right? Whereas, yeah, like you just
No
sort of...
interesting ideas from those guys after a while.
But yeah, like you just illustrated with that sort of the pathology of Chrissy Hines' lived experience and being able to sort of translate it into a visceral piece of music, especially such a traumatic experience. I do agree it's very effective. I didn't know that was the lyrical content of that song, but yeah, wow.
And it's not an area that music would dare to explore very often. I mean, if you found it in sort of...
Not before punk.
Yeah, I mean, even like classical music was so male dominated, and also like you would find it in maybe some outsider or like edgier literature, maybe. Poetry.
Yeah, sure.
But in popular music, not before punk, and I think that's why I guess I said art critics are really appreciating punk, and that's why people like Braille Marcus, an American, saw this UK punk moment as like, this is it. This is like the most important art of the 20th century.
Well, it's gritty.
Songs like this are
true.
why.
Yeah.
Albums like tracks like Tattooed Love Boys are reasons why.
Sure. No, yeah, I can't disagree, and I've always sort of felt that way about this album. It's like, objectively, I think it's like an amazing piece of music, and like it's appropriate that you mentioned, like, important in the rock world, like, or in the canon of rock music, because even just listening to it again recently, I'm like, this is the best example of, like, you know that genre I've often derided when you see a band on the Wikipedia page where the genre is just rock?
Yeah.
That's like album is the best of that. Like,
Yeah.
you would just label this as rock.
Yeah.
And it's the best that it could, like, for that, just that label,
Absolutely.
right?
Because even a lot of stuff can be sort of categorized as hard rock, and this isn't even quite that, you know what I mean?
No.
You could push it into new wave if you really wanted
be called
to, but it can be classified as rock, sort of uncontroversially. You know?
Yeah,
just that.
because it's new wave rock, and the new wave is the production capacity of it.
Yeah, people think of new wave, they think of like, you know, XTC and Devo and like sort of weirder stuff, you know what I mean?
And the parts where this is more than just
the
rock.
more straightforward new wave is like Elvis Costello has been a bit forgotten by comparison by younger generations, you know what I mean?
And I guess
Subsequent.
where this goes more beyond just that label of
Generations.
rock is the, like, production capacity of it. You
Yeah.
know, how things are layered and stuff like that. Whereas the part that, like, the thing about this album that's, like, kind of always in a, like I said, in an objective way, I think it deserves to be all the things you said. But in some, like, subjective sense, it's just never spoken to me in that, like, to be fair, I didn't know about that anecdote. That does sort of elaborate on that song in a more visceral way. But, I just always felt that, like, you even mentioned the band is so, like, creative and stuff like that. And even Chrissy has all these great ideas and stuff. And the thing that's always held this album back from my own subjective, like, capacity to put it as, like, great as people do say it is just that it wanted to be popular, you know? Like how I evoked Susie earlier, they sort of owned the not being popular thing, or at least the, like, their own thing. Whereas this did have a conscious effort to try to, and I do, like, appreciate that, and that's why I can't help but deny the objective capacity of this album, because it does succeed in being popular and creative and all the things you said, like I was gonna say, you know, if you know what I mean. It's exactly that. Like, I couldn't have put it better myself. But the thing is just like, I wish they didn't. I want to hear what it would have been like if they weren't trying to be popular and take all those musical ideas, you know.
As a separate album, sure.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I love that this is...
But that's what I was going to say.
I
The
love
fact
that this exists, and it would be the kind of music that my dad would appreciate, you know what I mean?
Which is why I can't help but, like, be glad that it exists. Because, like, it is that, not what I want it to be. You know what I mean?
Like, when I first heard it, I couldn't believe that there was an album that had, like, I'm just getting into post-punk and these more interesting sort of rock acts. You know, I was a David Bowie fan, and a band doing, like, this sort of style, whilst also kind of fulfilling this sort of, like, well, that I did have a soft spot for, you know, that sort of WSFM, like, sort of 80s anthemic rock that my dad liked, you know. It was magnificent to hear something that fulfilled both. But also because it very much had tracks that appealed, like, to someone like me in particular. Like, a track like, and close to being my favourite track on the album, you know, as much as I appreciate Chrissy's presence as a front woman and as a lyricist.
Yeah, for sure.
Space Invader.
Yeah.
That's, like, top 5 rock instrumentals of all time.
That's a great
This
one.
band fucking had it, man. Like,
But that's what I mean.
this is, like,
that's
the tightest fucking band, man.
No, yeah, that's what I mean by, like, if with the less popular sense, they could have been, like, really tight, like gone into weird. That's sort of what I meant. You know what I mean? But yeah, exactly. I completely agree.
Even in a commercial sense, or like more popular sense,
But it is ironic because they aren't as popular these days. They're
not
like
quite.
only people who were still from the time. Like they're almost like Dexy's Midnight Runners in that sense.
Well,
Like very few people I've met who are like into like the history of punk music really hold this one up. So I find that interesting in that sense as well. You know, where it's a really the people from the time think it's a classic, but it's been lost a bit in the years, which is a good choice for it to be on Mandala as well.
see, the second album features the same lineup. Although I thought it was pretty good, but it never spoke to me in quite the same way. But the thing is that the group are experiencing, especially the bassist and guitarist, are experiencing a lot of personal issues, if drugs and other perhaps mental problems. But by the third album, both of those guys unfortunately passed on. I think, well, the bassist had left the band, but the bassist, he passed away not long after he left the band.
Yeah.
And James Honeyman Scott was found dead, I think, at 26.
Wow.
And so on the third album, you had just Chrissy, the drummer, and a new bassist and guitarist. Unfortunately, the guitarist, whose name escapes me, but I'll quickly look it up, the reason they chose him is because James Honeyman Scott had said to Chrissy at one point, hey, as soon as we get the next album going, bring this guitarist aboard. I want to work with that guy. And so he wound up being his replacement, Robbie McIntosh. And I really like the third album, Learning to Crawl, actually, which is probably the most commercially successful in the long run. Because those are the tracks that you still hear on the radio, along with Brass in Pocket. From the first album.
Sure.
Back on the Chain Gang and Middle of the Road, both from Learning to Crawl. And
That's a good song title for a pop hit.
But yeah, I think that's a really good album. Personally, not as good as the first album, but I still like it a
Yeah.
lot. And
Nice.
and that's another one I've known since I was 17, so I've always been fond of it. And but the thing is, afterward, like, I don't know if Chambers is still in the band, but like the problem is, I don't even know if McIntosh is in the band that much. And like, the problem is, I think nothing against Chrissy, but like I think the Pretenders is ultimately those three guys.
Yeah.
That's the Pretenders, and I think they may as well just be Chrissy's with a band around Chrissy Hynde's solo album, because she actually doesn't have that many solo albums.
Sure,
because
Chrissy
they're
Hynde-
Pretender albums. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it should be called like Chrissy Hynde and the Pretenders.
Some of them may be even credited as that. To be fair,
Okay.
like she has one like solo album from like 2014. You know what I mean? Like she didn't need to make any. She's just doing Pretenders albums. That's essentially
Yeah.
what they're becoming at that point, for better or for worse. Like
I guess they just kept the name because that was a popular.
Yeah, like, and like maybe for all we know, the band wouldn't have wanted the name to stop or whatever.
Yeah.
And plus, I think Martin Chambers is probably in it enough that it's worth calling it that.
Okay.
Show him some respect. Like if he's just Chrissy Hynde's drummer, it's like he was a Pretender. You know what I mean? Call it the Pretenders.
An original member.
Yeah. But no, and then like I think the song on this album, Kid, is one of the top rock compositions of all time. And when I'm referring to James Honeyman Scott's guitar solos, this is the one that I have in mind. Both the one in the middle of the song and the one that closes the song. Like him and Pete Farndon's, like the bassist relationship there. It's so beautiful. It's a shame that the reason that Farndon was kicked out is actually because I guess Farndon's drug problem got bad enough that Scott said he would leave if Farndon wasn't kicked out. So it's a shame that those two had such phenomenal musical chemistry. It's a shame that like it got to that point.
Yeah.
Where like Honeyman Scott was going to leave if he wasn't kicked out, because Farndon's a great bassist. It's sad. And just that the instrumental of that song, Kid, and it's another bold example of Chrissy's bold songwriting, actually, because it's the plot of that song is shared with probably wasn't deliberate, but Sohrab Saleh's West German telephone from '76, Time of Maturity, which is to say it's about it's sung from the perspective of a mother who's trying to console the son who's found out that she's a sex worker. And it's just a really, like, even if you don't know the context of the song, it's just like I think the words and sort of the evocation that like this female voice like trying to console a younger male pathos, it really speaks to a lot of people. It's very universal, and just like the way the instruments and the sounds of the band bounce off the sort of the emotions, even the vague emotions if you're not listening to all the lyrics, how all that deliver. Like, I mean, Honeyman Scott's chimes there are just, they're the most beautiful on record, and it's amazing that Johnny Marr said there'd be no Johnny Marr without James Honeyman Scott, and he said one of the greatest moments of his life is when there was a sort of Pretenders reunion ish, and they had Johnny Marr playing the shows on guitar.
Nice.
And Johnny said like him playing Kid with them live was just like unexperienced like no other. A song he
Nice.
was familiar with as like a boy.
Like Morrissey with
he,
Bowie.
like he played guitar, learning guitar of James Honeyman Scott's solos.
Yeah, nice.
On Kid and playing it live like that. You can only imagine what that meant to Johnny Marr.
For sure.
You know, it makes you.
The member of the Smiths that isn't the megalomaniac.
Well, I don't know, because by all accounts, he said he's tried to make sure that the other band, the bassist and the drummer, don't get any money. And wasn't there an issue with
I think they both did that.
Vinnie
yeah.
Riley as well?
Oh no, I'm saying Johnny Marr's the one that's not the megalomaniac. Morrissey's the megalomaniac. Because that was on the Morrissey album with Vinnie Riley.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah,
sorry.
him and Stephen Street. They didn't credit him as like a writer and arranger and a bunch of songs, and then they left his name off the CD reissues altogether.
Yeah, that's cruel.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know if that's legal. It was one of those things where if it's not legal, you have to like pay for a lawyer.
And
to,
they
like,
just know
prove
Vinnie
it's
Riley's
legal.
not going to do that. That's why they did it, probably.
Yeah, they know his character. He's like a fairly humble guy.
He's just a quiet, like, kind of anxious.
Had
sort of
no aspirations for commercial success, or if he did, he was just going to do it on his own terms.
guy.
And
I think he just liked music.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these guys, you have to wonder, like, they probably wouldn't have hated it if, like, they had a hit single, if it was, like, something, one of their instrumentals, if, like...
Oh,
yes,
yeah, if it became, like, Chuck Mangione or something.
Yeah,
They'd
exactly.
probably be like, fuck yeah.
They'd like it, but... And especially all the money to make more music.
Yeah,
but,
easily, yeah.
They wouldn't, like, cater their career to it.
Or they wouldn't just play that song at their concerts and stuff. No.
No. And yeah...
Because they know if they just play that one song at their concerts, everyone who's there to see them is just going to walk away after they're done.
Yeah, it's amazing people who do that after buying a ticket, because, like, tickets...
Well, it's
much
like a
cheaper.
festival.
Oh,
It's
sure.
more so, you know,
Yeah.
rather than a concert.
But anyway, and then obviously I mentioned Brass in Pocket before, and Mystery Achievement,
Special K.
one of the great, yeah, I love Special K, one of the great final tracks on any rock album or music album. I love Mystery Achievement, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that's a good one.
God, this is like the best sequencing in rock music. This whole album, absolutely phenomenal. I can't.
It
praise
does a
it
good
enough.
job of sequencing like the themes and emotions, like as in the musical themes. You know, it'll go from one sort of pastiche to the next. Like, you know, it'll go from a song that does a bit of a reggae thing into like one that does a bit of like a sort of dancehall thing, and then goes into one like later on that goes from like a ballad into like a you know what I mean. It matches the different styles together before it goes through all the styles.
Yeah.
So it's not just one style, the next style, the next style. That you like, it moves through it gradually in that way. It's very creatively sequenced. I do agree. Yeah.
And I guess a couple other songs worth mentioning, of course, Private Life, which is also recorded by Grace Jones, but this version is extremely good too. Maybe I even like it slightly more, I'm not sure. And of course, a cover of a slightly obscure Kinks song from the first album's era, Stop Your Sobbing.
Yeah.
Stop.
That's a very Kingsy song for sure.
Yeah, this is as good as an album gets, in my opinion, without, like, a rock album gets, without removing itself from, like, the pure sort of, like, rock and roll context.
It's
I mean,
probably-
it's acknowledging the new wave era.
This might be like the best rockist / like rockist pop album.
Yeah, because even, like, a lot of the glam stuff was evoking space or even slightly, like, post-Flower Child stuff.
Yeah,
or, like,
more heavy
even, like,
art
bluesy
concepts.
Americana. Whereas, like, this is just, like, sort of, like, you know, leather outfits, sort of just, like, you know, street kids, you know, hanging out in, like, clubs and gigs and gigging, like, rock music, you know what I mean?
Yeah, jukebox sort of music.
Yeah, exactly. Like, not too, like, subculturally punk, not too sort of, like, eccentric sort of XTC, sort of, like, you know, jagged marionette new wave.
Yeah.
Yeah, and better than anything. I mean, I like the song Moods for Moderns, but other than that, like, I'm not the biggest Elvis Costello fan. And I don't hate the guy, but I'm not the biggest fan either.
Sure.
That being said. Yeah, huge fan of this album. I was very excited to
To
be
be
able to be
fair,
the champion.
XTC do the new wave marionette, but they do other things.
I know, I'm just talking about, I say, 79 or so.
Or Black Sea is like the most like new wave marionette.
Oh, yeah, that too, yeah.
That's kind of why I love it. It's
I
like
love most of their
it's like
albums,
Talking
yeah.
Heads taken to the nth degree. That Black Sea album.
Yeah, I think that's all I got to share. I believe.
Yeah, for sure.
that-
New wave's a
that
weird
is-
phenomenon, eh? It's just like such a. It's also interesting how genres, like, you know, they attach it to it for like marketing purposes. Whereas, like we were saying, this is more just like that Wikipedia rock. in the best possible way, like in almost the like top of Everest sort of way.
Yeah, it's new wave insofar as a lot of new wave, in the very certainly in the more mainstream, accessible sense, was actually trying to do that. You know, like be straightforward rock again.
Yeah, that's
like
true.
Costello and maybe someone like you know, what's his name? Kershaw, Nick Lowe, those sort of guys. Nick Lowe?
Nick Lowe. I know the name, but I'm not sure.
Ian Dury, you know, that sort of thing.
Oh, Jury's a bit more like disco-y punk, you know.
Yeah, no, Nick Lowe, who's who I was thinking of. He was like sort of a pub rock sort of guy.
Okay, yeah, I don't know much of Nick Lowe. Yeah, I've just heard the name. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't say I've heard his music, to be honest.
No, I just know of his name, like sort of associated with that sort of world, and but yeah, and you know, but,
Yeah, no, it's funny because.
or Joe Jackson's another example of that actually.
Okay.
I would say. Back to basic sort of rock.
Well, just on the subject of like, yeah, even genres. Like, I remember reading my older brother wrote like an RYM review of some like electronic dance track. According to the review, he heard like at a bush stuff he randomly came across while walking around High, in Sydney Park, and then like they were playing some weird sort of psytrance music that wasn't as like heavy or whatever, and it was a bit more like naturalistic or something. And he's like, "What's this called?" To one of the people he tried to ask for ketamine, and they said, it's called prog. So it was some weird like new style of like electronic rave music. It was called prog. How weird is that?
That's fascinating. Anyway.
Yeah.
If that's all, I suppose that's we're closing on the Pretenders there. There's no other releases we had lined up today.
Rock prog album.
Prog.
No, I'm just joking. Though they do with the song where she goes like, "Ooh," sounds a bit like Rush doing The Police.
Okay. Well, so that's that. I suppose it's worth signing off now. Thank you, everyone. That's nearly 3 hours of stuff. Thank you,
Jesus
everyone.
Christ.